I've been securing foreclosed houses for banks and mortgage servicers for going on 9 years now, working 3 counties out of a company called Crossroads Property Preservation. And there's exactly one line item on my checklist I no longer complete, no matter what the work order tells me to do. I don't nail windows shut. It sounds like a small thing to build a rule around. My supervisor Paulette has told me more than once that it's going to cost us a contract someday, because leaving a window on a vacant property unsecured is the kind of thing that gets flagged in an audit. And audits are how a company like ours keeps its bank contracts in the first place. I've had 4 callbacks over it since the fall I stopped doing it. I've eaten every one of those callbacks without an argument, because I was the one who wrote the report that let me keep doing this job at all. And I know exactly which house made me change the rule. It was a 2-story farmhouse 11 miles outside a town most people have never heard of, sitting back off a gravel road that washes out twice a year. And by the time my nephew Cody and I finished with it, the county had it flagged for demolition instead of resale, which almost never happens with a house that's still standing and structurally sound. The Wardlow place didn't have anything wrong with its bones. It had something wrong with what was still living in the routine of it, and it took us 3 visits to understand that the thing wrong with the house wasn't in any single room. It was in what the house believed was still true. I want to walk you through it in the order it actually happened, because the order matters. If I told you everything I know now at the start, none of the early parts would sound like anything. They didn't sound like anything to me either, not at first, and I found a way to explain almost every piece of it, right up until I couldn't anymore. That's most of this job, honestly. Finding an explanation that lets you keep sleeping. The Wardlow place ran out those explanations faster than any property I've worked before or since. Before I get into who I am and how I ended up standing on that porch with a work order in my hand. If you're the kind of person who likes hearing about ordinary jobs that turn into something else, go ahead and subscribe now, because I've got a fair number of these and I tell them the same way every time, straight, in order, no embellishment. And if you've got somebody in your life who thinks they'd have handled a locked farmhouse better than my nephew and I did, send them this one. I'd be curious whether they still feel that way by the end of it. My name's Dale Kessler. I'm 41. Before this line of work I framed houses for a builder out of Springfield for about 12 years, until my knees told me they were done with ladders and I believed them faster than most guys do. A friend from the framing crew got me into property preservation work, which most people outside the industry have never heard of either, so I'll explain it the way I explain it to anybody who asks. When a bank forecloses on a house, or a mortgage servicer takes possession of one through some other process, somebody has to physically go out and secure that property so it doesn't become a liability sitting there empty. That's us. We change the locks. We winterize the plumbing so pipes don't burst and flood a house nobody's watching. We mow the yard so the county doesn't fine the lender for a nuisance property. We photograph every room, every appliance, every water stain and crack, and we send that photo set back with a condition report that becomes part of the file the bank uses to decide what happens to the house next. Sell it as is, order a full clean out and repair it for resale, or in rarer cases walk away from it entirely and let the county take it for taxes. Most of what we do is unglamorous and repetitive. You learn a rhythm to it. You learn what a house looks like when a family left in a hurry versus when they left with time to plan. And you learn which kind of vacant house is more likely to have somebody still squatting in it when you show up with your key. You learn the smell of a house that's had its water shut off for 6 weeks versus 6 months. None of that sounds like the start of anything unusual, and for years it wasn't. It was a job. I liked parts of it. I liked that every house told you something true about the people who'd lived there, whether they meant it to or not. I'll admit, looking back now, that there was one earlier job that should have taught me something the Wardlow place only confirmed later. 2 or 3 years before any of this, I secured a small brick ranch house on the other side of the county where an elderly man had died alone, no different from 100 other files, except that on our second visit a kitchen clock that should have stopped the day the power got cut was still keeping accurate time. I remember standing there staring at it, doing the same math I'd do again years later at the Wardlow place, and deciding it had to be battery operated, even though I never actually found a battery compartment on the back of it before we hauled it off with the rest of the trash out. I let that one go without much thought at the time. I didn't have a framework yet for taking a detail like that seriously. By the time I stood in Edith Wardlow's front parlor looking at a lamp with no meter on the pole, I understood I'd been handed that framework once already, and hadn't picked it up. I should say a little more about the work itself before I get further into the story, because the details matter later and I don't want to have to stop and explain procedure in the middle of the tense parts. Every property we secure gets what the industry calls a condition score, a simple letter grade the bank uses to sort its files at a glance. An A property is move-in ready, needing only cosmetic work before resale. A D or an F usually means structural damage, fire, flood, or long-term neglect severe enough that demolition is on the table before anybody bothers listing it. Most of what I work sits in the B to C range, houses that are fine, just tired, needing paint and carpet and somebody to haul off what got left behind. I want you to hold on to that grading scale, because it comes up again near the end of this, and it's part of why what eventually happened to the Wardlow file struck me as so unusual. My nephew Cody started writing with me about 8 months before the Wardlow job. He's my sister's boy, 24 at the time, taking business classes 2 nights a week at the community college and needing steadier money than his warehouse shift was giving him. I told my sister I'd keep an eye on him, which in this line of work mostly means teaching somebody not to walk into a dark basement without checking the floor joists first, and not to assume a house is empty just because the work order says it is. Cody picked the job up faster than I expected. He had good instincts for reading a room the way we needed to read them, for noticing what was missing as much as what was there. He also had a habit of making jokes in tense moments that used to annoy me, and later, at the Wardlow place, I was grateful for every one of them because they were the only thing that kept either of us talking normally toward the end. He wasn't a nervous kid by nature, which is part of why the Wardlow job affected him the way it eventually did. He'd worked 2 summers on a wildland fire crew before deciding office work wasn't for him and a desk job wasn't either, and he had a level head around actual physical danger, chainsaws, unstable structures, the kind of thing that spooks a lot of young guys his age. What he wasn't used to was a danger he couldn't get his hands around, and I think that's the real difference between how the two of us processed what happened out there. I've spent my whole working life trusting what my hands and my tape measure tell me. Cody had spent 2 fire seasons trusting the same thing, trusting that if he respected a fire line and read the wind right, he'd come home. Neither one of us had ever had to figure out how to respect something that didn't follow any physical rule either of us understood, and I think that's a large part of why it cost him more than it cost me, even though I was the one who'd gone looking for it. I should tell you one more thing about myself before I get into the actual job, because it matters later, and I'd rather you have it now than have it feel like I'm explaining myself after the fact. About 1.5 years before the Wardlow work order came in, my mother started showing signs of memory trouble that we couldn't explain away as normal aging anymore. She's in a care facility now, has been for over 1 year, and my sister and I spent one weekend last spring clearing out the house she'd lived in for 31 years, boxing up everything that mattered and everything that didn't, deciding in about 4 seconds per item what stayed and what went to a dumpster. I still have boxes in my garage I haven't opened since that weekend. I don't know why I'm telling you that except that it's true, and it's part of why this particular job got under my skin the way it did. I go into a lot of houses where somebody's life stopped abruptly and somebody else has to decide what that life gets reduced to. I usually manage to keep that at arm's length. I didn't manage it with the Wardlow place, and I don't think it was only because of what happened there. I think I walked in already primed for it, and the house knew exactly where to press. The work order came through Fallaleep on a Tuesday in October, a standard initial secure assignment for a property at the end of Dry Hollow Road, out past the edge of Ferris County's incorporated line, close enough to a little town called Cutter's Fork that we used it as our reference point on the GPS, but far enough that cell coverage started dropping the last 3 miles in. The order listed the lender as Meridian Trust Loan Servicing, the file number, and the basics: single-family residence, 2-story farmhouse, built sometime in the 50s based on the county assessor record, previous owner deceased, no remaining occupants, reverse mortgage foreclosure, estate disclaimed by the sole heir. That last part wasn't unusual. When somebody dies with a reverse mortgage and no equity left in the house, the heirs often don't want any part of it, because taking the estate means taking the debt along with whatever's inside, and most of the time what's inside isn't worth the trouble of claiming it. The previous owner's name was on the file too: Edith May Wardlow, 84 at the time of her death, widow of a man named Harold Wardlow who'd passed 11 years before her. no children. One nephew of record living out of state in Tulsa who'd already told the bank by phone that he wanted nothing to do with the property and wouldn't be traveling out for any kind of clean-out or estate sale. That's who ends up disclaiming an estate, generally. Somebody distant enough that the house is a legal obligation and not a place they remember visiting. I want to be precise about the sequence of orders on this file, because it matters for understanding what came later. The first order was strictly an initial secure, change the locks, install a lockbox with a code the bank's local agents could access, do a full walkthrough with photographs for the condition report, winterize the plumbing since the county gets cold enough by November to split a pipe, and note anything requiring immediate attention like a leaking roof or an obvious break-in. A separate order, not yet issued, would eventually cover the trash out, meaning the full removal of the previous owner's belongings, since the nephew hadn't authorized that step yet and the bank doesn't pay for it until they're sure they're not going to need to preserve the contents for some estate or legal reason. That meant when Cody and I first walked into the Wardlow house, everything Edith Wardlow owned was still exactly where she'd left it. Every house we secure like that feels a certain way. This one felt more like that than most, and I noticed it before I noticed anything actually wrong. We took the county highway out past Cutter's Fork on a clear, cold Thursday morning, turned off onto Dry Hollow Road where the pavement gives out and the gravel starts, and followed it back almost 2 miles through second-growth timber and a couple of open cattle pastures before the road dropped down toward a low-water crossing over a creek the county map calls Sites Branch. On the far side of that crossing the road climbs again, cuts along a ridge, and the Wardlow place sits back off the gravel behind a wire fence and a stand of old cedars, with a long dirt drive running up to a 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch on 2 sides and a detached barn behind it that had seen better decades. It's the kind of house you'd call handsome if you saw it 50 years ago and call a project now. Peeling paint, a sagging porch step, but a good steep roofline and windows that were still square in their frames, which told me the house had been built well even if it hadn't been maintained well lately. There was an older man standing at the end of the drive when we pulled in, leaning on the fence post with a hand resting on a dog's head, watching us the way people watch strangers on a road that doesn't get much traffic. Cody clocked him before I did and made a comment about how we should have brought the paperwork in a binder instead of a folder so it looked more official to the neighbors. I told him that was a good instinct, and I meant it. Rural properties like this one almost always have somebody nearby keeping an unofficial eye on things, and it's worth knowing who that is early, because they can save you a lot of trouble or cause you a lot of trouble depending on how the conversation goes. The man's name was Arlen Voss. He lived in the next place up the road, an old dairy operation he'd mostly let go fallow except for a few beef cattle, and he told us straight off that he'd known Edith Wardlow since they were both younger than either of us standing there. He mentioned, almost as a courtesy, that Edith had quilted for the church auxiliary for close to 50 years, that half the houses on that road had one of her quilts folded away somewhere, and that she and Harold had never had children but had, in his words, more or less raised half the kids on Dry Hollow Road at one point or another through Bible school and canning season and every other small-town institution that requires somebody's kitchen table. He told it plainly, without much sentiment in his voice, the way people talk about someone they've genuinely lost rather than someone they're performing grief over for a stranger's benefit. I remember thinking, standing at that fence line, that whatever else this job turned out to involve, it involved erasing the last physical evidence of a woman a lot of people in that hollow had actually loved, and that this was true of most of the houses I worked whether I let myself think about it or not. He didn't ask to see identification. He didn't ask for the bank's paperwork. He asked, in a tone that wasn't hostile but wasn't friendly either, what exactly we were there to do to the house. I told him the truth, because in my experience that's the only thing that works with a man like Arlen. We were there to change the locks, take some photos, and make sure the pipes wouldn't freeze over the winter. Nobody was there to tear anything out or clean anything up yet. He nodded slowly at that, like he'd been braced for a worse answer, and told us he'd been checking on the place himself since Edith passed, mowing a strip along the road so it wouldn't look abandoned, making sure nobody'd broken a window. I thanked him for that, because unmaintained rural vacants get vandalized or scrapped for copper wiring at a rate that would surprise you, and a watchful neighbor is worth more to a bank than they'll ever know to appreciate. Before we walked up the drive, Arlen said one more thing that I wrote down in my notes that night, mostly because it struck me as sad rather than strange. He said Edith had left the porch light on for going on 11 years, every single night since Harold died, because Harold used to work second shift at a plant over in the county seat and she'd started the habit so he'd have light to see the steps by when he got home late. And she'd just never broken it even after there was nobody left to come home. He said it like he expected us to turn that light off as part of the job, and he wanted us to know it before we did, so it wouldn't feel like we were doing it carelessly. I told him we'd be as respectful of the place as we could be. I meant that too. I didn't think much else about the porch light at the time. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy for me to tell this story now like I noticed something ominous in it from the start, and I didn't. It sounded like exactly what it was, an old woman's small private ritual, the kind of thing that accumulates in a marriage and outlives the person you built it for. I've got a few of those myself. Most people do. The lockbox code the bank had given us worked on the front door without trouble, which isn't always the case with these older reverse mortgage files, since sometimes the original keys never make it into the system and you end up drilling a deadbolt on the porch in front of God and the neighbors. This one was clean. The door swung open onto a front hall with a coat rack still holding 2 coats, a woman's wool one and, a size too small for a grown man, what must have been Harold's old field jacket, kept 11 years past its owner. The house smelled the way most of these houses smell after a few weeks shut up with no HVAC running. A little close, a little dusty, undertones of whatever the last meal cooked in that kitchen had been, gone stale in the walls. Nothing unusual. Nothing that told me this house would end up different from the 200 or so I'd already secured by that point in my career. We started the walkthrough the way we always do, front to back, ground floor first, photographing each room from 2 angles for the condition report before touching anything. Front parlor with a floral sofa and a console television that still had a doily on top of it. Dining room with a table set for exactly one, a single placemat and a single chair pulled slightly out from the others, like she'd eaten breakfast there the morning she was taken to the hospital and nobody had pushed the chair back in since. Kitchen with a farmhouse sink, a percolator on the stove, a calendar on the wall still turned to the month she died, with small handwritten notes in the boxes. Doctor, church, Arlen Ree fence. Nothing that read as anything but an ordinary life running its ordinary course right up until it stopped. Cody was the one who noticed the lamp. We'd come back through the front parlor to check the window latches before heading upstairs, and he stopped in the doorway and said, kind of offhand, that he thought I'd told him the power was already cut on this one. I told him it should be. The bank's file listed the utility account as terminated the week after Edith's death, standard procedure once a property enters foreclosure processing, and our own work order specifically noted no electric service on site, but the lamp on the side table by that empty reading chair was on. Not bright, not obviously so in the daylight coming through the front windows, but on. The little brass switch turned and the bulb glowing that pale color they glow in daylight when you almost don't notice. I remember exactly what I thought at the time, because it's the kind of thought I've had at a dozen other houses. I thought the utility company's paperwork was behind the actual disconnection, which happens more often than you'd expect in rural co-op territory, where a lineman might not get out to physically pull a meter for a week or 2 after the account shows terminated in the billing system. I made a note to confirm with Ferris Electric Cooperative directly instead of trusting the bank's second-hand summary, switched the lamp off myself, and we kept moving. It didn't feel like anything. It felt like a paperwork lag, which in this business is about the least interesting explanation available, and also, 9 times out of 10 the correct one. We finished the ground floor, worked our way upstairs through 2 bedrooms and a bath, photographed everything, checked every window latch and painted most of them shut for the winter the way the checklist required back then, before I'd changed my rule about that. Edith's bedroom was the second one, smaller than I expected for a house that size, with a narrow bed neatly made, a housecoat hung on the closet door, a pair of slippers set together at the foot of the bed the way some people leave them, ready to step into first thing. On the dresser sat a framed photograph of a man I took to be Harold, younger than I'd have guessed, standing in front of a tractor with the kind of grin men used to give the camera before it became normal to look bored in photographs. We locked up, reset the new deadbolt, mounted the lockbox on the porch rail, and Cody took a few exterior photos while I made notes for the report. On the drive back out past Arlen's place, I saw him again at the fence, and I told him the lamp had been on, mostly to ask if he'd been inside recently. He said no, hadn't set foot past the porch since the ambulance took her. Said he didn't think it was his place to go inside somebody else's house even to check on it. Said he only ever mowed the strip along the road. I believed him. There wasn't any particular reason not to. I filed the lamp under paperwork lag, wrote up the condition report that night at my kitchen table, and thought that was more or less the end of my personal involvement with the Wardlow place until the 30-day check came due. I want to pause here and tell you something about how these files usually go, so you understand why none of this felt significant yet. A bank doesn't just secure a property once and forget about it. As long as a foreclosed house sits unsold, our contract requires periodic checks, typically every 30 days, to confirm the property's still secure, the lockbox still works, nobody's broken in, the yard hasn't grown up past the fine-worthy height, the pipes haven't burst. We call these curtailment checks internally, though the bank's paperwork usually just calls them drive-bys, even when they require going inside. For a house like the Wardlow place, sitting a couple of miles down an unpaved road where a neighbor's already keeping half an eye on it, 30-day checks are about as routine as this job gets. I'd done dozens of them on other properties without a single thing worth mentioning happening at any of them. I had every reason to expect the Wardlow file would be the same. It wasn't. 31 days after the initial secure, Paulette put the curtailment check on my schedule along with 2 other properties in the same general direction, which is how we usually stack these jobs, grouping them by road so you're not burning half a tank of gas checking one lockbox. Cody came with me again. It was colder by then, first week of December, the cedars along Dry Hollow Road dusted with a frost that hadn't burned off yet by the time we crossed the low-water bridge over Sites Branch. Before we even got to the porch, I noticed the mailbox at the end of the drive was gone. That wasn't unusual on its own. Removing the mailbox post is a standard step on our checklist for a property expected to sit vacant a long stretch, because an overflowing mailbox is one of the clearest visual signs to a passerby that a house is empty, and empty houses draw a certain kind of attention we're trying to avoid. I'd put in the work order for the post office to be notified and the box removed after the first visit, and either the bank's local agent or the post office itself had followed through faster than usual. Good. One less thing. What I didn't expect was the little stack of mail sitting on the porch swing, tucked under a flat stone to keep it from blowing off in the wind. I want to be careful here because this is the point where I could make it sound more dramatic than it actually felt walking up to it. At the time, my first thought wasn't supernatural. My first thought was that somebody, probably Arlen, had been collecting whatever stray mail kept coming after the box was pulled and leaving it on the porch out of some instinct not to just throw a dead woman's mail in the trash. That's a normal thing a decent neighbor does. I picked up the stack, maybe 6 or 7 pieces, mostly what you'd expect. A grocery store flyer addressed to current resident. A property tax reminder that had clearly been generated before the county system updated to reflect the foreclosure. A couple of pieces of what looked like charity solicitation mail, the kind that goes out to elderly names on purchased lists for years after anybody stops responding to it. And then one envelope near the bottom of the stack that was different from the rest. Plain white, hand-addressed in blue ink, to Mrs. Edith Wardlow, at the Dry Hollow Road address, with a return address I didn't recognize, no name on it, just a street number and a town in a neighboring county I'd never had reason to drive through. It had a postmark on it, a real one, ink-stamped, dated 4 days prior. I stood there on that porch longer than I should have, turning that envelope over in my hands, because it didn't fit anything I understood about how mail works after somebody's died and their box has been pulled from the root. I asked Cody to hold on to the rest of the stack and I walked it up to Arlen's place myself before we even went inside the house. Mostly because I wanted an easy explanation and I figured he was the most likely source of one. He wasn't. He looked at the envelope for a good while, turned it over the same way I had, and told me flat out he hadn't put any mail on that porch. Not that stack. Not ever. That he made a point of not touching anything on the property beyond the strip of grass he mowed along the fence line. He said if there was mail sitting there, he had no idea where it came from, and something in the way he said it made me believe him, because he didn't seem interested in covering for himself. He seemed genuinely unsettled by it, which for a man who'd struck me as pretty unflappable on the first visit, was its own kind of information. I called the post office in Cutter's Fork later that day. Once I had a signal again heading back toward the highway, and spoke to a clerk who pulled up the address and confirmed for me, without much interest in the question, that delivery to that route stop had been discontinued the same week we'd requested the mailbox removed, over a month prior. No carrier had that address on any route anymore. She checked twice because I asked her to. Same answer both times. Whatever that envelope was, it hadn't come through a mail carrier assigned to that road, at least not according to the post office's own records. I logged it in my notes that night the way I log everything, factually, without editorializing, because that's the habit this job trains into you. Unexplained mail item, current postmark, delivery route discontinued per USPS confirmation, return address unverified. I told myself it was probably some kind of automated mailing error, a database somewhere that hadn't updated, a piece of mail that got physically routed by an old carrier who hadn't been told the stop was gone yet and dropped it out of habit before somebody else pulled the box. Rural mail systems run on more human inconsistency than people realize. I've seen stranger clerical mistakes than a single piece of mail arriving at a discontinued stop. I want you to understand that this explanation genuinely satisfied me at the time. It's only in hindsight, once I had more pieces, that it stopped holding up. I kept that envelope anyway, unopened, in the glove box of my truck for a few days before I finally worked up the nerve to actually try tracing the return address printed on it. It listed a street number on a road in the next county over. No business name. Nothing to suggest what kind of sender it might be. I looked the address up on a mapping service one evening and found, instead of a house or a business, an empty lot between two other properties. The kind of grown-over gap you see where a structure used to stand and got cleared decades ago. I called the county assessor's office for that county the next morning, gave them the address, and asked what if anything had ever been built there. The clerk on the phone, after a long pause while she pulled the parcel history, told me the lot had last held a small rural clinic, a doctor's office really, that had closed and been demolished in the late 1980s, well over 3 decades before that envelope showed up with a fresh postmark on Edith Wardlow's porch. I asked her, feeling a little foolish even as the words came out, whether she had any record of what that clinic had been called or who had run it. She found an old parcel note listing it only as a general practice, no further detail, nothing that told me anything I could use. I never did figure out what that envelope actually was, where it had truly come from, or what it said, because I never opened it. I kept it instead, sealed, and it's sitting in the same folder as the rest of my Wardlow paperwork to this day. I've thought more than once about opening it. I still haven't. We went inside to finish the actual curtailment check, and that's when I found the lamp on again. The exact same lamp, the one by the reading chair in the front parlor, the one I'd personally switched off with my own hand a month earlier and noted in the report as off with no service connected. On. Same pale daytime glow. I stood in that doorway for a second, feeling something shift in my chest that I want to describe honestly rather than dramatically. It wasn't fear yet. It was more like the specific unease you get when a number doesn't add up on a work site, when a measurement is off by an inch you can't account for and you know, before you even start checking your tape, that somebody's going to have to explain it. I'd already put in the request to Ferris Electric Cooperative to confirm the account status directly rather than trusting the bank's summary, and I called them from the porch while Cody kept working through the rest of the checklist inside. The woman I spoke with, after putting me on hold to pull the physical service record rather than just the billing record, told me something that made the paperwork lag explanation a lot harder to hold on to. The meter had been physically removed from the pole at that address 6 weeks earlier. Not just the account closed in the billing system. The actual meter, pulled by a lineman, logged with a work order number she read out to me. Standard procedure for a property expected to sit vacant through a foreclosure. There was no meter on that house. There was no way for electricity to be reaching that lamp, full stop, regardless of what any account status said. I went back inside and looked at the meter base myself, around the side of the house near the kitchen, and she was right. Empty socket, a little plastic tag zip tied to the conduit noting the pull date and the tech's initials. No meter, no connection. I stood there in the cold with my breath fogging, looking at that empty socket, and then went back around to the front parlor and looked at that lamp glowing its pale daytime glow with absolutely nothing behind the wall to power it, and I did what I think most people in my position would do. I looked for the extension cord. I checked the outlet. I checked whether maybe somebody had rigged a battery pack or a solar charger somewhere, because at that point I would rather have believed in a prankster with technical skills than believe what I was actually looking at. Minder, there was nothing. The lamp was plugged into the wall outlet the way it had always been plugged in, the way it was plugged in the first day we walked through, and the wall outlet led, as best I could trace it without pulling drywall, to a dead panel with the main breaker already switched off and the meter sitting in a box on a shelf in my own truck, because we'd pulled it during the first visit and were supposed to drop it at the co-op's recycling center, which I confirmed I still had, sitting right there where I'd left it. I switched the lamp off again. I didn't touch anything else in that room. I told Cody what I'd found, and to his credit he didn't make a joke about it that time. He walked over and looked at the lamp in the outlet and the dead panel himself, quiet in a way that wasn't like him, and then he asked me the question that I didn't have a good answer for yet, which was simply, well then how? I told him I didn't know, and then not knowing yet didn't mean there wasn't an answer, it just meant we hadn't found it. That's true, and it's also the thing I told myself for longer than I probably should have. We finished the rest of the walkthrough. Nothing else in the house had visibly moved that I could confirm against my first visit photographs, not that day, though I want to be honest that I hadn't yet gone back and compared every single frame side by side. We reset the lockbox code per the schedule, confirmed the exterior was secure, and drove out past Arlen's place without stopping, mostly because I didn't have anything useful to tell him yet and I wasn't ready to hear whatever he might say back. I spent that evening at my kitchen table doing something I don't normally do on a curtailment check, which was pulling up the full original condition report from Visit 1, and going through every photograph frame by frame, comparing it against the mental notes I'd taken that day. Most of it matched. The dining room table, the coats on the rack, the calendar on the kitchen wall, still turned to the month she'd died, but there were small things. The chair at the dining table, the one pulled slightly out from the others, was pulled out a little further than it had been in my first visit photo. Not dramatically. An inch, maybe two. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking at two photographs side by side, which is exactly what I was doing. I told myself furniture settles. Houses shift on their foundations with temperature changes, especially old farmhouses without modern insulation, and a chair on an old hardwood floor can slide slightly with vibration from wind, from a truck passing on the road, from 100 small causes that have nothing to do with anybody touching it. I want to be fair to that explanation, because it's not a stupid one. Houses do move. I've felt floors shift under my own feet in buildings that age, but I noted it anyway, the way I was noting everything by then, because a decent tradesman learns to trust the pattern of small discrepancies even when he can't yet explain any single one of them on its own. The second thing I found, comparing photos, was the slippers at the foot of Edith's bed. In the first visit photo, they sat together, toes pointed roughly toward the closet, the way I'd seen them set in 100 other elderly folks' bedrooms, the last ordinary thing a person does before getting into bed each night. In the second visit photo, taken that same afternoon before I'd found the lamp, before any of this had started registering as more than paperwork oddities, those slippers sat a few inches apart, and they'd been turned. Toes pointed now toward the bedroom door, like somebody had stepped into them and then out of them again, facing the direction a person would face if they were about to walk out of that room. I didn't sleep much that night, if I'm honest, though not because I was frightened yet. I was doing the thing I do with any job that doesn't add up, running the discrepancies over and over, looking for the thread that connects them, because in my experience there's always a thread, even if it's a boring one. A squatter with a key somehow. A previous contractor who'd left something running before Crossroads picked up the file. A relative nobody had mentioned who still had access and was quietly grieving in a house nobody knew they were visiting. Any of those would have made sense of a moved chair or turned slippers. None of them made sense of a lamp glowing with no meter on the pole and no power in the panel. There was a third discrepancy I found that same evening, comparing photos, one I hadn't mentioned to Cody yet because I wanted to be sure of it before I said it out loud. The house coat that had hung on Edith's closet door in every photo from the first visit was gone from that hook in the second visit photos. I searched the room's frame carefully before I let myself draw any conclusion, in case it had simply fallen or been knocked loose by a draft, and found it instead laid out flat across the foot of the made bed. Sleeves smoothed down at the sides, the way a person lays out an outfit the night before an early morning they don't want to fumble through in the dark. It was a small thing on its own, paired with the slippers turned toward the door and the dining chair migrating toward an 11-day-old photograph. It stopped feeling small. It felt like watching somebody, in careful, unhurried stages, get ready to go somewhere. I called Paulette the next morning and asked her, without explaining the full reason, to pull whatever history existed on the Wardlow file from before Crossroads picked it up, curious whether an earlier contractor might have handled an initial visit before ours and left something running or something unfinished that could account for any of it. She found nothing. Crossroads had been the first and only crew assigned to that property since the bank took possession, the file clean and unremarkable right up until my own reports started flagging anomalies. She asked in the careful tone she uses when she thinks I'm about to tell her something she doesn't want to hear, whether everything was all right out there. I told her I didn't know yet, which was the truest answer I had. 2 weeks later, before the next scheduled curtailment check, Cody called me on his own time, which he almost never did, to tell me he'd been thinking about the Wardlow place and wanted to go back out and look at something specific. He'd noticed on the second visit a thin layer of dust across the hallway floorboards upstairs, the kind that settles fast in an unheated, unoccupied house, and he wanted to know if I'd photographed the floor itself in either visit, separate from the rooms. I hadn't, not deliberately. It's not standard practice to photograph bare hallway floor, but it turned out I had by accident in the wide shots I'd taken of each doorway for the condition report. And when we pulled those photos up side by side that evening on my laptop, we found something neither of us wanted to find. In the second visit photo, faint in the dust along the upstairs hallway, there was a line of small prints. Not boot prints, not sock prints. The soft, slightly rounded shape of a slipper sole, a woman's size by the look of it, walking a single line from the top of the stairs down the hallway toward the back bedroom, the smaller of the two upstairs rooms, the one we'd used mostly for storage. Boxes of old canning jars and folded quilts that Edith apparently hadn't gotten around to using in years. One direction. No return trail. No overlap, no confusion, nothing that looked like more than one pass. Just a single, deliberate line of prints and dust that, according to my own checklist notes from Visit 1, we had swept clear of that hallway ourselves. Standard procedure. Because a dusty entry makes a house look neglected in photographs and the bank likes clean-looking condition reports. That dust had been laid down fresh sometime in the month between our visits, in an unheated house with a locked door and a lockbox nobody but us and the bank's local agent had the code to, and something wearing slippers the approximate size of the pair sitting at the foot of Edith Wardlow's bed had walked through it exactly once, toward a room nobody had any reason to enter. Before I let myself consider anything outside the range of normal explanations, I did what 9 years in this job has trained me to do, which is exhaust the boring answers first. I called Paulette and asked her to pull the lockbox access log, because the boxes we use aren't the old-fashioned combination kind anymore, they're electronic, and every time somebody opens one with a code it logs the date, the time, and which code was used. There are exactly 2 codes active on any given property at a time, ours and the bank's local agents, and the log for the Wardlow house showed exactly 2 entries since the initial secure, ours on the day of the second visit. That was it. No other code had opened that box, which meant, barring somebody picking the mechanism itself, which leaves marks I would have noticed and didn't, nobody had gotten into that house through the front door since the day we changed the locks. I checked every other point of entry myself on a return trip I made alone on a Saturday, without telling Cody, partly because I didn't want to worry him over what I expected to be nothing, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me wanted to see whether the house behaved differently when it was just me. It was a strange thing, standing on that porch alone with the truck idling in the drive behind me, working up the nerve to go back into a house that had up to that point done nothing more overtly threatening than turn on a lamp and rearrange some furniture. I want to be honest that fear doesn't always scale to the size of the evidence in front of you. A moved chair shouldn't have been enough to make my hands unsteady on that lockbox keypad. And it was anyway. It didn't, not that day. Every window I'd painted shut was still painted shut, the seals unbroken, the back door deadbolt hadn't been forced, the basement bulkhead doors were padlocked the way we'd left them. I went up into the crawl space under the back porch with a flashlight, checked for any gap in the foundation skirting a person or animal could use, and found nothing but a healthy amount of spider webbing that hadn't been disturbed. Whatever was moving through that house wasn't coming through a door, a window, or a crawlspace gap. I want to be clear that this did not comfort me. It removed one category of explanation and left the remaining ones a great deal less comfortable. I drove up to Arlen's place that same afternoon, mostly because I'd run out of boring answers, and I had a feeling, from the way he'd reacted to that envelope on the first visit, that he was sitting on something he hadn't told us yet. He invited me in, which he hadn't done before, sat me down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't really want but drank anyway because refusing felt rude in that particular kind of house. The kind with a rooster clock on the wall and a Bible on the counter, and a man who'd clearly lived alone a long while and appreciated the company more than he'd admit. I asked him straight out if there was anything about Edith Wardlow, or about that house, that he thought I should know. He was quiet for a good while, turning his own coffee cup on the table, and then he told me something I hadn't asked about directly but that turned out to matter more than anything else he said that day. He told me that when the ambulance came for Edith, the morning she had her stroke, he was the one who found her, because she'd called him on the phone before she lost the ability to speak clearly, and he'd gotten there before the ambulance did. He said she was frightened, not of dying. He didn't think she understood yet that she was dying, but frightened the way anybody is frightened when their body stops obeying them without warning. He said the last coherent thing she managed to say to him, before the paramedics took over, was to ask him to look after the house while she was gone, and specifically, and he remembered this because it struck him as strange even in the moment, to leave the kitchen window over the sink cracked open a couple of inches, and to make sure the porch light stayed on, because she said she'd be right back and she didn't want to come home to a house that had been shut up tight in her absence. He said he'd promised her he would. The way you promise anything to somebody being loaded into an ambulance, meaning it in the moment without fully thinking through what it would mean to keep it. And he had kept it, he told me, right up until we showed up with the bank's paperwork and painted every window in that house shut, including the one over the kitchen sink, and switched off a porch light that had been burning every night for 11 years before that morning and every night after it for the 2 weeks Edith spent in the hospital before she died there. I asked him why the kitchen window mattered to her specifically, out of every window in the house, and he told me something that at the time felt like an old woman's private superstition, and only later felt like something closer to instruction. He said Harold's ashes sat in an urn on the windowsill above that sink, had for 11 years, and Edith had always said, half joking and half not, that Harold liked the air, that she cracked the window for him the way she used to leave the porch light on for him, and that she'd told Arlen more than once, in the kind of offhand way people mention things they've decided not to examine too closely, that she intended for her own ashes to sit right there next to his one day, and that whoever handled things after her would need to know to keep that window open a crack, always, no matter the season, because that was where she meant to stay. I sat with that for a while before I said anything back to him. I want to tell you honestly that at that point in the story I still didn't think I was dealing with anything beyond a grieving neighbor's guilt and a run of genuinely strange but probably explainable coincidences. But I remembered, very clearly, standing in that kitchen on the first visit and painting that exact window shut myself because it was on the checklist, because every window on a winterized vacant property gets sealed against weather and intrusion as a matter of routine, and I remembered not thinking about it at all while I did it. The way you don't think about most items on a checklist you've completed 200 times before. I asked him whether he'd ever heard of anything like this happening at another property in the Hollow, on the theory that a place with this much history might not be entirely unique to Edith's. He thought about it a long while before answering, the kind of pause that told me he was deciding how much to say rather than trying to remember. He mentioned, finally, an old dairy barn 2 farms up that had burned under circumstances the fire marshal never fully explained, years before I'd started in this line of work, and a house even further out that had sat vacant for the better part of a decade because, in his words, nobody local would take it even at a price that made no financial sense to refuse. He didn't offer details on either, and I didn't push him for them, partly because I could tell he'd already told me more than he'd planned to when I first sat down at his table, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to be carrying around a second unexplained house on top of the one I already had a file open on. Arlen asked me, in a voice that had gone quieter, whether the lamp was still coming on. I told him it was. He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd already half decided, and told me he didn't go inside that house anymore, hadn't since the day the ambulance left, and that he intended to keep it that way, and that if I had any sense I'd think hard about what I was willing to do to a house that a woman had asked, with maybe her last clear words, to be kept a certain way for her. I drove home that evening turning that conversation over more than I wanted to admit. I still had a job to do. The bank doesn't care about an old woman's dying wish regarding a kitchen window. The bank cares about a winterized, insured, secured asset that won't cost them money in burst pipes or liability claims before it sells. I had a contract to fulfill and a nephew whose paycheck depended partly on me fulfilling it competently. But I started noticing, over the next several days at my kitchen table going back through the file, a pattern I hadn't let myself see clearly until I had Arlen's story to hang it on. The estate paperwork the bank had forwarded included, buried in a stack of documents nobody had specifically told me to review closely, an older set of photographs, taken about 2 years earlier for a homeowner's insurance policy renewal, the kind where an agent walks through and photographs the contents for coverage valuation. I pulled that photo set up next to my own condition report photos from Visit 1 and Visit 2, room by room, and what I found stopped me flat. My Visit 1 photos, taken the week after Edith's death, showed a house that was close to but not identical to the insurance photo set from 2 years prior. Small differences you'd expect from 2 years of an elderly woman living alone. A stack of mail on the counter that hadn't been there before. A different set of dishes in the drying rack. A throw blanket moved from one chair to another. Ordinary drift, the kind any lived-in house accumulates. My Visit 2 photos, taken 1 month later, had drifted again, but not randomly. They drifted toward the insurance photos. The dining chair that had moved an inch further out in Visit 2 matched, almost exactly, its position in the 2-year-old insurance photograph. The dish rack, which I hadn't specifically photographed but Cody had caught in the background of a kitchen wide shot, held a set of plates in an arrangement closer to the older photo than to my own Visit 1 shot. It wasn't decaying toward disorder, the way an empty house usually does. Dust piling, cobweb spreading, small entropy compounding. It was reorganizing itself toward a specific earlier configuration, and the more I dug through both photo sets side by side, the clearer it became that the configuration it was moving toward wasn't the day of Edith's death, and it wasn't 2 years ago either. I found the actual date on that insurance photo set eventually, printed small in the corner of the agent's cover sheet, and cross-referenced it against the hospital records the bank's estate file included, the transport report from the morning Arlen found her. The insurance photos had been taken 11 days before that morning. Not 2 years, though the policy renewal cycle made it look that way at a glance. The photographer had come out for an unrelated water damage claim on the barn roof, and photographed the whole property while he was there, including the house, less than 2 weeks before Edith Wardlow left it in an ambulance and never came back. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with those 2 photo sets open side by side, the Visit 2 condition report and the insurance photos from 11 days before her stroke, feeling something settle into place that I hadn't wanted to name yet. This house wasn't drifting randomly, and it wasn't decaying the way every other vacant property I'd worked eventually decayed. It was resetting itself, piece by piece, visit by visit, toward the exact way it had looked the last time Edith Wardlow was a healthy woman living an ordinary life inside it, the last morning before everything changed. I could explain a chair moving an inch. I could, with real effort, explain a lamp with no power source if I allowed myself some theory about residual current or a fault I hadn't found yet. What I couldn't explain, not with any theory that let me keep sleeping easily, was why every single unexplained change in that house pointed toward the same specific moment in time, converging on it a little further with every visit we made. That was the point where I stopped thinking of the Wardlow place as a house with a wiring problem and a busybody neighbor, and started thinking of it as a house that was waiting for something, and organizing itself in preparation for whatever that something was. Before I let myself accept the pattern lock theory as anything more than an educated guess, I did one more thing I haven't mentioned yet, because it's the piece of this story I'm least comfortable telling. Not because it's frightening exactly, but because it's the part where I decided on my own, without authorization from the bank or a word to Paulette, to treat a client's property like a personal investigation rather than a straightforward job. On a Tuesday between the second and third scheduled visits, I drove out to the Wardlow place alone with a battery-powered trail camera I'd bought years earlier for deer season and never gotten much use out of, and I mounted it on a bookshelf in the front parlor, angled to catch the reading chair, the lamp, and most of the room in one frame, set to trigger on motion with a fresh set of batteries I'd tested myself that morning, and a memory card with more storage than I figured I'd ever need for a 2-week window. I told myself I was gathering evidence, and in a sense I was, but I think the honest reason was that I needed something outside my own perception to confirm or deny what I'd started to believe. Some kind of proof that didn't depend entirely on Cody and me trusting our own memories against each other. I checked the lockbox log on my way out that day and confirmed again that no other code had accessed the property since our last visit. I locked the door behind me, drove out past Arlen's place without stopping, and made myself wait the full 2 weeks rather than driving back out early and risking whatever I might find changing its behavior because it knew it was being watched, which I recognize now was an odd thing to worry about regarding a house, and worried about anyway. When I finally retrieved that camera on the morning before our scheduled third visit, the batteries were dead, completely drained, even though the model was rated for months of standby life on a fresh set and I'd personally tested them with a multimeter before I ever installed them. The memory card had recorded a little over 900 still frames over what the camera's internal clock claimed was only the first 4 days of the 2-week window, which meant either the clock had failed or the camera had been triggering on motion almost constantly during that stretch, far more than any settling house or passing headlight glow through a window should have caused. I sat in my truck in that driveway and went through those frames one at a time before I ever set foot back inside. The first several dozen showed nothing unusual. An empty room and low light, timestamps a few minutes apart, consistent with the camera occasionally misfiring on nothing more than its own sensor drift, which trail cameras do more often than hunters like to admit. Then, a little over halfway through the sequence, the frames started showing the lamp on, glowing that same pale color in shot after shot, no gradual transition, just off in one frame and on in the very next one taken 90 seconds later. I kept going. Somewhere past frame 600, the reading chair, empty in every previous image, showed a depression in the cushion, the unmistakable impression of somebody having sat in it, though no frame before or after captured anyone entering or leaving that seat. And in the last several dozen frames the camera managed to record before its batteries finally gave out completely. The chair's depression was gone, the cushion smooth again, but the lamp had been joined in the frame by something I still don't have a clean way of describing. A soft, uneven blur low near the floor beside the chair, present in 11 consecutive frames and then simply absent from the 12th, with no frame in between showing any clear transition from one state to the other. I didn't show those images to Cody until we were back at my kitchen table that night. Both of us hunched over my laptop screen scrolling through them slowly. He asked me more than once whether I thought the blur near the floor could be a lens flare or a bug on the sensor, and I told him I'd wondered the same thing and hadn't been able to rule it out entirely, which was true, and which is also the closest thing to comfort either explanation could offer at that point. I want to be honest that I've gone back and looked at those frames many times since, and I still can't tell you with certainty what that low blur was. I can tell you it was roughly the size and shape of somebody kneeling. I didn't share the full weight of what I'd started to believe with Cody right away, even after showing him the camera frames. I told him the parts that were useful for the job, that we needed to be more careful, more observant, that I wanted him photographing bare floor and door thresholds every visit from then on, not just the rooms themselves. He asked me more than once whether I thought we should hand the file back to Paulette and let another crew take it. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't tell him the real reason I didn't want to hand it off, which was that some part of me, the same part that still had unopened boxes from my mother's house sitting in my garage, didn't feel right about walking away from a house that seemed to be trying so hard to get back to a version of itself where somebody was still coming home. The next scheduled visit was the trash out inventory walk, which the bank had finally authorized after the nephew and Tulsa signed off on a full clean-out, effective the second week of January. That visit was supposed to be the last time either of us needed to set foot in that house before a separate crew came to physically remove Edith Wardlow's belongings. It ended up being the one where we got trapped inside it for the better part of a night, and where I finally understood, in a way I couldn't rationalize away anymore, exactly what the house wanted, and what it was going to cost me to give it. The trash out inventory walk was scheduled for the second Saturday in January, A date I remember exactly because the National Weather Service had a flood watch posted for 3 counties including ours, on account of a warm front moving up from the south that was going to dump heavy rain on top of a snowpack that had been sitting in the hills for the better part of 2 weeks. I almost rescheduled. I want that on the record, because it would be easy for you to hear this next part and think we walked into an obvious danger with our eyes closed. We didn't. A flood watch in that part of the country in January isn't rare enough to cancel a workday over, not by itself, and the trash out inventory only needed a few hours if the house was as straightforward as most estates are. I checked the forecast that morning, saw the heavy rain wasn't expected to arrive until late afternoon, and figured we'd be back across the low water crossing on Sites Branch with hours to spare. Cody didn't ask to skip it, which surprised me a little given everything we'd found on the last 2 visits. But he told me later, once it was all over, that some part of him wanted to see it through rather than hand it off to another crew and always wonder. I understood that. I'd felt the same pull, even after everything I'd read in those side-by-side photographs. The inventory walk is different work from a curtailment check. It's slower, more granular. You go room to room and log every significant item, not just photograph the space in general, because the report determines what gets appraised, what gets donated, what gets scrapped, and what the estate might still be legally entitled to claim value from. That kind of work forces you to actually handle a dead person's belongings in a way the earlier visits hadn't. Opening drawers, checking closets, cataloging jewelry and documents you'd otherwise never touch. It puts you in close contact with the texture of somebody's life in a way that ordinary securing work doesn't. And I think that closeness is part of why what happened that day hit both of us as hard as it did. We started in the front parlor and worked methodically, the way I always do, Cody calling out items and condition while I logged them on the tablet. The floral sofa, moderate wear, no visible damage. The console television, non-functional, likely scrap value only. The reading chair with its lamp, still switched off from my last visit, still with no meter on the pull to explain how it had ever been on in the first place. We moved through the dining room, the kitchen, cataloging the percolator, the dishes, the calendar still turned to the month of her death, and I want to tell you that up through about the first 90 minutes, nothing seemed different from what we'd documented before. The chair Cody had noticed migrating in earlier visits sat exactly where the insurance photos showed it. It had finished its drift. That should have told me something on its own, that whatever process was moving through that house had reached a completed state in the rooms downstairs, but at the time I registered it more as relief than warning. One less thing shifting under us. It was the back upstairs bedroom, the one we'd used mentally as a storage room, where the real trouble started that day. On our first 2 visits, that room had held exactly what you'd expect. Boxes of canning jars, folded quilts stacked on a cedar chest, a sewing machine under a dust cover, the ordinary overflow of a life lived in one house for decades. When we opened that door on the trash out walk, the room wasn't a storage room anymore. It had been arranged, sometime in the week since our last visit, into something closer to a guest bedroom prepared for a specific arrival. The cedar chest had been moved against the wall. A narrow bed, one I hadn't even known was in that house, made up with sheets that looked recently laundered rather than months stale, sat where the sewing machine table had been, and on the floor beside that bed sat a small vinyl suitcase, half open, with a few items folded neatly inside it. A nightgown, a hairbrush, a rosary I later confirmed, from a photograph in the estate file, had belonged to Edith's own mother. I stood in that doorway with my tablet in my hand, supposed to be logging condition and estimated value, and I couldn't make myself start typing. Cody came up behind me and went quiet the same way. Neither one of us touched anything in that room for a long moment. I want to describe exactly what that suitcase looked like, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else from that day. It wasn't packed the way a person packs for a trip. It was packed the way somebody packs when they expect to be gone only briefly and plan to come straight back to the rest of their life waiting exactly as they left it. A single nightgown, not several. A hairbrush, not a full toiletry kit. The kind of bag you'd throw together at 4 in the morning with an ambulance already in the driveway, grabbing only what felt essential in the 2 minutes you had. Cody knelt down by that suitcase, careful not to touch it, and pointed out something I hadn't clocked yet myself, which was a folded piece of fabric tucked along one side of it, half hidden under the nightgown. It was Harold's field jacket, The same one that had hung on the coat rack in the front hall since our very first visit. The one size too small for a grown man's shoulders because it had belonged to Harold when he was younger and leaner, decades before he died. I walked down to the front hall right then to check, tablet still in my hand, heart going harder than I wanted to admit, and confirmed what I already knew I'd find. The coat rack held one coat now instead of two. Edith's wool one, still there. Harold's field jacket, gone from its hook downstairs and folded instead into a suitcase upstairs meant, as far as either of us could tell, for a woman being packed to leave, not a man already 11 years dead. Cody asked me, standing in that hallway, whether I thought that meant Harold was coming too, wherever the house believed Edith was headed, and I told him honestly that I didn't know, that I'd stopped trying to guess the internal logic of whatever we were dealing with, and started just documenting what it did instead. That answer didn't satisfy either of us, but it was the truest one I had. I checked the estate file later that week and confirmed what some part of me had already guessed standing in that doorway. There had been no suitcase found with Edith Wardlow at the hospital. The ambulance report noted she was transported with no personal effects, understandable given the nature of a stroke emergency. Nobody stops to pack a bag when a woman can't speak clearly and time matters. Whatever bag she might have meant to bring, whatever bag Arlen might have promised, in the chaos of that morning, to bring along later and never managed to, had never made it out of that house. And now, months after her death, in a room we had photographed twice before and found nothing resembling a guest bedroom in either time, that exact kind of bag sat half-packed on the floor, as though the house itself was still trying to finish the errand nobody else had gotten around to completing. Cody was the one who said it out loud first, and I remember being grateful he did, because I don't think I would have let myself say it as plainly. He said it looked like the house was trying to pack for her, not commemorate her, not memorialize the day she died. Actually get ready to send her somewhere, the way you'd get a person ready for a trip you expected them to return from. I made myself finish logging that room, because the job doesn't stop being the job just because it stopped making sense, and because I think some part of me needed the routine of the checklist to keep functioning at all in that moment. We photographed everything, cataloged the suitcase and its contents as a single line item, and moved on to the last room, meaning to finish the walk and get out well ahead of the rain the forecast had promised for late afternoon. We didn't make it out ahead of the rain. It came in faster and heavier than the forecast had called for, the kind of front that outruns its own prediction, and by the time we'd finished the last room and started carrying our equipment back down to the truck, the sky had gone the particular greenish gray that anybody who's grown up in that part of the country learns to take seriously. I checked my phone, caught one bar of signal on the porch, long enough to see a flash flood warning had replaced the watch, specifically naming Sites Branch and half a dozen other low water crossings in the county as likely to become impassable within the hour. We made a decision I still think was the right one given what we knew at the time, which was to wait it out rather than try to beat the water across a crossing that flash floods hard and fast in that kind of terrain, filling a dry creek bed to several feet of moving water in under 30 minutes when the hills funnel enough runoff into it at once. People die every year in that county trying to cross flooded low-water bridges in vehicles that get swept sideways before the driver even understands what's happening. I've known 2 people, distantly, who didn't make it out of a crossing like that. I wasn't going to risk it for the sake of beating a delay by an hour or two, not with Cody in the truck with me. So we sat in the cab in the driveway for a while, watching the rain come down harder, listening to the weather radio cycle through the same warning language on repeat, and I told Cody we'd give it until dark and reassess, that the creek usually dropped back to passable within a few hours of the rain letting up, and that worst case we'd wait it out until morning rather than risk the crossing in the dark on top of everything else. He didn't love that plan, but he didn't argue with it either, because he'd grown up in that county same as I had, and he knew the math on it as well as I did. What neither of us loved was the idea of waiting it out inside that particular house. But the temperature was dropping along with the rain. The cab of the truck doesn't hold heat well once the engine's off, and I made the call that we'd be better off, practically speaking, sheltering inside a structurally sound farmhouse than freezing in a truck cab all night, especially once it got fully dark and we could no longer see well enough to keep working outside anyway. I told myself and told Cody that we'd treat it like any other job. finish the last of the paperwork by flashlight, stay together, stay alert, and get out the moment that water dropped enough to cross. I want to be honest that some part of me also wanted to see what the house would do with both of us inside it after dark, uninterrupted, for longer than we'd ever stayed before. I'm not proud of that curiosity looking back. I think it's the same instinct that makes a person keep pressing on a bruise to see how much it hurts. And I think it cost us more that night than it should have. We went back inside a little before 6, full dark by then with the rain still coming steady, and I did one more thing before we settled in that I want to describe carefully, because it matters for what happened later. Standing in the kitchen, working by flashlight since there was obviously no power to rely on, I looked at that window over the sink, the one Arlen had told me Edith wanted left cracked, the one I'd personally painted shut during the initial secure visit. It was still shut, paint seal unbroken, same as every other window in that house. Whatever was moving through those rooms, whatever had packed that suitcase and turned those slippers and pulled that dining chair inch by inch back toward an 11-day-old photograph, it hadn't managed to open a painted window from the inside, or hadn't tried. I remember finding that oddly reassuring at the time, the idea that there were still limits, still things the house apparently couldn't do. I was wrong about how much comfort to take from that, but I didn't know it yet. We set up in the front parlor with our flashlights and the last of the paperwork, and for close to an hour nothing happened beyond the ordinary sounds of an old farmhouse taking on a heavy rain, water running off the roofline, wind working at a loose piece of gutter somewhere, the house settling the way old houses settle. Cody made a couple of jokes about our life choices that I was grateful for, because they were the only thing in the room that felt normal. At one point, working through the last of the inventory sheets by flashlight, I caught myself looking at that reading chair by the dead lamp and thinking about my mother, about the recliner she'd sat in every evening for as long as I could remember, the one my sister and I had to decide whether to keep or donate during that one long weekend clearing out her house. I hadn't told Cody much about that weekend, only the bare fact of it, and I found myself telling him more of it that night, sitting in a dead woman's parlor waiting out a flood, than I'd told almost anybody. He listened without saying much, which is its own kind of kindness from a 24-year-old, and for a while the house felt less like a house full of unanswered questions and more like just a quiet room where two people were talking honestly to pass the time. I mention that because I think it's part of why what came next hit me as hard as it did. We'd let our guard down exactly the amount a house like that seems to wait for. Then the phone rang. Not a cell phone. The house phone, an old wall-mounted unit in the kitchen I'd noted on the first visit and assumed, along with everything else, to be disconnected along with the electric. I hadn't thought about it since. Landlines get bundled with all kinds of legacy billing arrangements out in the county, and it turned out later, when I finally chased down the actual paperwork, that the phone line ran through a different, older account entirely. One the bank's foreclosure processing hadn't caught because it predated the current billing system by a couple of decades and had simply kept auto-renewing on a minimal legacy plan nobody had thought to check. That's the boring explanation for why a phone line could still technically carry a signal into that house. It is not an explanation for what came through it. Cody and I both heard it ring, twice, the old mechanical double jangle those wall units make, and we looked at each other for a second before either of us moved. I picked it up, mostly because standing in a house that had spent 3 visits demonstrating it could turn on lamps with no power source, I figured a live phone call was, relatively speaking, the least strange thing that could happen next. There was no dial tone when I picked it up. There was a recording, or what I understood at the time to be a recording, playing partway through, like I'd picked up in the middle of it rather than at the start. A woman's voice, older, breathless in a way that didn't sound like acting, saying something to somebody I couldn't hear on the other end, asking them to please hurry, saying she couldn't feel her left hand right, saying she needed somebody to look after the house while she was gone, needed the window kept open and the porch light on, saying she'd be right back. She just needed somebody to promise her she'd be right back. I recognized the shape of that call before I let myself fully understand what I was hearing. It was close enough to what Arlen had described to me at his kitchen table, the morning Edith called him before the ambulance came, that I don't think it can have been anything other than some version of that exact conversation, or as much of it as had ever existed to be recorded, playing back through a line that had no earthly business carrying any signal at all into a kitchen with no active service and no caller waiting on the other end. I set the receiver back down without saying anything into it. I want to explain why, because some part of me, even in that moment, wanted to answer, wanted to say something back to that voice, and I made a conscious decision not to, mostly out of an instinct I couldn't fully explain, that answering something like that might be agreeing to something I didn't yet understand the terms of. Cody asked me what I'd heard. I told him, as plainly as I could manage, my voice steadier than I actually felt. He went pale in the flashlight and didn't say anything for a while, and I didn't blame him. We should have left right then, water or no water, and I've thought about that decision more times than I can count in the months since. But the crossing was still running high. I'd checked the gauge reading on my phone during the one window of signal I'd caught, and driving into moving water in the dark felt, even after that phone call, like the more immediately dangerous option. So we stayed, and about 40 minutes later, the last and worst thing that house did to us happened, and it involved my nephew being somewhere he had no way of getting to on his own, and a voice that sounded exactly like mine calling him toward it. I want to walk through the next stretch slowly, in the order it happened, because I've told this part of the story to exactly 3 people since it happened: my sister Paulette, and a deputy named Roy Marsh who took our statement afterward, and every time I tell it I catch myself wanting to speed past it. I'm not going to do that here. It's the part that matters most, and rushing it wouldn't be honest to what it actually felt like living through it. After the phone call, we moved into the kitchen together, both of us, because neither one of us wanted to be in a separate room from the other anymore. Not after hearing a dead woman's voice come through a disconnected line. I checked the basement door off the kitchen hallway, more out of habit than anything, because part of securing a property against a flood watch means confirming the lowest point of the structure isn't taking on water, and an old farmhouse basement with a dirt or rough concrete floor is exactly the kind of space that floods first and worst in heavy rain. I found about 2 inches of standing water already pooled at the bottom of the basement stairs when I opened that door and shone my flashlight down. Which wasn't good news, but also wasn't alarming on its own. Old basements in that county take on some water in a hard rain almost as a matter of course. I made a note to check it again in half an hour and closed the door most of the way, leaving it cracked because the latch had never worked well. Cody and I sat at the kitchen table after that, going back over the paperwork by flashlight, less because we needed to, and more because it gave our hands something to do. We talked, quietly, about ordinary things, his classes, my sister, whether the crossing might drop enough to get out before midnight. I want you to understand that in that stretch of maybe 20 minutes, the house was almost peaceful. No lamps, no footsteps, no further sound from that phone. I let myself believe for those 20 minutes that whatever had needed to happen that night had already happened. That the call had been some kind of release rather than an escalation, and that we'd get through until the water dropped without anything worse. I checked my phone twice during that stretch, more out of nervous habit than any real hope of a signal that far back in the hollow with the storm still overhead. And both times found nothing, not even the single flickering bar I'd caught earlier on the porch. The second time though, the screen showed something that made me sit up straighter. A battery percentage that had dropped nearly a third in the span of maybe 15 minutes, despite the phone sitting untouched on the table the whole time. No apps open, no signal search burning through the charge the way a phone does when it's actively hunting for a tower. I didn't say anything to Cody about it right away. I checked his phone instead, under the excuse of seeing whether he had any signal either, and found his battery had dropped a similar amount over roughly the same window. Neither of us had an explanation for that beyond the cold. And cold does drain a battery faster than normal, especially in an old device, but neither of our phones was new enough to rule that out completely, and neither of us was quite ready yet to add one more unexplained thing to the pile sitting on that table between us. Then I heard Cody's voice call my name from the front of the house. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because it's the detail that still bothers me most out of everything that happened at the Wardlow place. Cody was sitting directly across the kitchen table from me. I was looking at him when I heard his voice, clear as anything, call out Dale from the direction of the front parlor, 30 feet away through 2 doorways. His mouth wasn't moving. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I'm sure I was wearing the same one. The look of a man who has just heard something happen that his own eyes are telling him is impossible. We didn't say anything to each other for a second. Then, from the same direction, it called my name again, and this time Cody heard it too. Close enough to his own voice that he told me later, once we'd had time to talk it through properly. that for one full second he genuinely doubted whether he'd made the sound himself without realizing it, some kind of blackout or sleepwalking of the mouth, before he looked at me and confirmed I'd heard the exact same thing from a body that hadn't moved. I'm not going to pretend I handled that moment with any particular courage. I sat very still for several seconds, and so did Cody, both of us waiting to see whether it would happen again. It didn't, not from that direction, not in that voice. What happened instead was worse in a quieter way. From the basement through that door I'd left cracked, I heard my own name called this time, in Cody's voice, sounding urgent, sounding scared, sounding exactly like a 24-year-old man calling for help from somewhere he shouldn't be. Cody was still sitting across the table from me. I watched his face go through the same recognition mine must have gone through a moment earlier, and then I watched him do something I understand completely and still wish he hadn't, which was stand up fast enough to knock his chair over and start toward that basement door before I could stop him, because some instinct older and faster than reasoning told him that voice needed him regardless of what his own eyes and ears were telling him about where he actually was. I got up after him, telling him to wait, to think, that it wasn't real, that we both knew it wasn't real, and I believe he heard me, because he stopped at the basement door with his hand on the frame rather than going straight down. But the voice came again from below, closer to the bottom of the stairs by the sound of it, still calling his name in mine, and I watched something in him give way to it that I don't think he could fully help, because grief and instinct don't always listen to logic even when the logic is sound. He said, quiet, almost apologetic, that he had to check, just in case, just to be sure, and he started down those basement stairs with his flashlight before I got a proper grip on his arm to stop him. I followed him down. I want that clear. I didn't let him go alone, whatever else went wrong that night. The basement stairs were narrow, unfinished wood, and by the time both our flashlights hit the bottom, the standing water I'd checked 20 minutes earlier had risen considerably, not flooding the whole space yet but covering the lowest few feet in a dark, cold sheet that told me the creek behind the property, or some drainage feeding off it, had breached faster than I'd accounted for. Cody's light swept the room, an old root cellar space really, shelving along one wall still holding a few dusty mason jars, a rough concrete floor sloping toward a drain in the far corner, and no source anywhere for the voice we'd both heard. Nothing and nobody down there but the two of us and rising water. That's when the basement door at the top of the stairs swung shut on its own, hard enough that I heard the old latch, the one I'd told myself didn't work well, catch audibly in a way it had never once caught for either of us in 3 visits of testing it. I'm not going to describe what the next several minutes felt like in a way that oversells it, because I don't think the fear itself is the important part of this story. The important part is what we actually did, because that's the part that got us out. I went up those stairs first and worked that latch by feel and by flashlight, and it took real effort, more than a stuck latch should have taken, before it finally gave and the door swung open again. In the time that took, maybe 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes, the water in that basement rose enough to reach the bottom 2 stairs, and Cody, who'd stayed below trying to find any other way out in case the door didn't give, told me afterward that he'd felt, more than heard, something moving in the water near his ankles that wasn't the current from wherever it was rising from. Something that touched past his leg once and then didn't again, and that he still to this day doesn't want to guess what that was. I want to describe the climb back up those stairs honestly, because it's the part I still dream about more than any other single moment from that night. The water had reached the point where each step up meant leaving a colder, darker version of the room behind, and I remember counting the stairs under my breath without meaning to, the way you count something when you need your mind occupied by anything other than what it wants to think about instead. Cody was ahead of me by then, and I had one hand on his shoulder the whole way up, not out of any real plan, just because I needed to be touching something solid and warm in a room that had for those 90 seconds stopped feeling like it belonged to the physical world I understood. When the latch finally gave under my other hand and the door swung open into the kitchen, the ordinary flashlight-lit ordinariness of that room, the percolator still sitting on the stove, the calendar still turned to a month 2 seasons gone, felt for a second like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. We got up and out of that basement together, both soaked to the knee, both breathing harder than the short flight of stairs should have accounted for, and I pulled that basement door shut behind us and did something I hadn't planned to do, which was drag a kitchen chair over and wedge it under the handle. An old trick, not one I'd ever have thought I'd need in a property preservation job. I don't fully know what I thought that would accomplish against whatever we were dealing with. I think honestly it was less about the physics of the latch and more about needing to do something with my hands that felt like taking control of a situation that had stopped making any sense. We stood in that kitchen afterward, both of us dripping onto Edith Wardlow's floor, and I remember Cody saying, in a voice that was trying hard to sound steadier than it was, that he didn't want to spend the rest of the night in that house no matter what the creek was doing. I told him I agreed, and that we'd go check the crossing right then, on foot if we had to, rather than stay another hour inside those walls. But before we moved toward the front door, I found myself, almost without deciding to, walking instead toward the kitchen window over the sink. I want to explain why, because it wasn't a plan I'd worked out in advance. It was closer to a realization arriving all at once, the way the pattern lock moment with the photographs had arrived weeks earlier, except this one came with a feeling attached to it rather than just an observation. Everything that house had done, from the very first lamp switching on, had been aimed at one specific goal, and I understood it standing in that kitchen with water in my boots and my nephew's voice still echoing wrong in my ears. It wasn't trying to hurt us. I don't believe that then or now, even accounting for what happened in the basement, which I think was closer to panic and urgency than malice. The house doing whatever it could to keep two living people inside it a little longer because it had been alone with only itself for 2 months and had, in whatever way a house like that can want something, wanted company as badly as it wanted Edith home. What it actually wanted, the whole shape of everything we'd found across 3 visits, was for somebody to finish what Edith herself had asked to be finished the morning she left, and what none of us, not Arlen, not the bank, not 2 property preservation contractors following a standard winterization checklist, had actually done. I found the paint scraper in my tool bag, still sitting by the front door where I'd left it, and I went back to that kitchen window and worked the blade along the seam I'd sealed myself 2 months earlier, breaking that paint bond one careful pass at a time while Cody stood behind me asking, more than once, what exactly I thought I was doing and whether now was really the time. I told him I thought I finally understood what the house had been asking for since the very first visit, and that I intended to give it, because I didn't think we were getting out of that night cleanly until somebody did. I got that window loose and cracked it open 2, maybe 3 inches, the cold wet air coming through it smelling like rain and creek water and cedar, and I reached over and found the porch light switch by the back door, the one on the same dead circuit as every other fixture in that house. No power reaching it any more than power had ever explained the lamp in the front parlor, and I flipped it on anyway. Nothing about the room lit up. There was no dramatic glow, no sudden warmth. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though some visible transformation happened the moment I did those 2 things, and that isn't what I experienced. What I experienced was quieter and in its own way harder to describe convincingly, which is that the air in that kitchen changed. I don't have a better word for it than that. The pressure of the room, the particular tightness that had been building since we first heard the phone ring, eased, the way a headache eases when you finally take something for it. Not instantly gone, but clearly, measurably better than it had been a moment before. I said something out loud, standing at that sink with the window cracked and the dead porch light switched on, that I haven't repeated to many people since, because it feels private in a way the rest of this doesn't. I said her name, and I told her that whoever she'd been waiting to come back for her, they weren't going to make it, that I was sorry, and that she didn't need to keep the bag packed anymore because nobody was coming to carry it for her, but that didn't mean she had to keep waiting by the door either. I don't know if that was the right thing to say. I don't know if it mattered what I said at all, or whether it was the physical act of unsealing that window and switching that light back on that mattered. Fulfilling, 9 weeks late, a promise a frightened neighbor had made to a dying woman and a foreclosure checklist had accidentally broken. I only know that within a few minutes of doing it, Cody and I both noticed the rain outside had eased from a hard, steady downpour to something closer to a drizzle, faster than the forecast had predicted it would. And when I checked the gauge reading on my phone during a brief window of signal on the porch a short while later, the creek level at Sight's branch had already begun to drop. We didn't stay to watch the rest of it. We got our gear together, checked that every door was locked and every window we hadn't just opened remained secure, left the kitchen window cracked exactly as I'd left it, and drove out around 1 in the morning once the crossing had dropped low enough to risk it carefully, headlights catching the water still moving fast but shallow enough across the gravel that I felt reasonably confident of it. Neither of us said much on the drive back into Cutter's Fork. I think we were both too tired, and too aware that whatever we'd try to say wouldn't sound like anything sensible outside the walls of that house, even to each other. We stopped at the only place still open at that hour, a gas station with a coffee machine that had seen better decades, and stood in the fluorescent light of that little store for a long while, longer than either of us needed to buy anything, just letting our eyes adjust to a kind of light that had nothing uncertain about it. Cody bought a candy bar he didn't eat, and turned over and over in his hands instead, and I remember the clerk behind the counter, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19, looking at the two of us like she could tell exactly how our night had gone without either of us saying a word about it. The way people who work overnight shifts in small towns learn to read that particular look on a customer's face. She didn't ask, we didn't offer. I bought coffee I didn't finish, and we sat in the truck in that parking lot for the better part of an hour before either of us felt steady enough to drive the rest of the way home, watching the sky behind Cutter's Fork go from black to the flat gray that comes an hour or so before real sunrise. Neither of us saying much of anything. Both of us, I think, doing the same quiet work of trying to decide how much of what had just happened we were going to let ourselves believe by daylight. I called Paulette first thing the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, and told her most of what had happened, though I softened the basement part more than I probably should have, because I didn't fully trust my own account of it yet in the daylight, and I didn't want to sound like I was asking to be pulled off active duty over a scare in a flooded basement. She listened without interrupting, which isn't like her, and when I got to the part about the kitchen window and the porch light, about deliberately undoing 2 items on a completed winterization checklist, she went quiet in a way that told me she was doing the math on what that would mean for the file before she said anything else. She asked me, carefully, whether I understood that an unsecured window on a vacant property was a liability the company couldn't easily explain to the bank if anything happened to that house before the trash-out crew came through. A break-in, weather damage, anything at all. I told her I understood that completely, and that I was going to leave it that way regardless, and that if the company needed to write me up over it, I'd accept that. But I wasn't going back out to reseal that window, not on the Wardlow property, and as it turned out, not on any property after it either. I want to give Paulette real credit here, because she didn't have to do what she did next. She could have pulled the file from me entirely, assigned another crew, treated the whole conversation as evidence I'd had a bad night and needed a break. Instead, she asked me to write up everything, in full, exactly as I remembered it, not for the bank's condition report but for our own internal file, the kind of documentation that normally only exists for liability purposes when something's gone wrong on a job site. She told me she'd read it herself before deciding what, if anything, needed to go further up the chain. I spent most of that Sunday writing it, and I think that report is close to word for word what I've told you here, minus a few details I hadn't fully worked out yet at the time. Cody didn't come back out to Dry Hollow Road again. I don't fault him for that, not for 1 second, and I made sure he never had reason to think I did. He finished out the trash-out coordination from the office instead, working with Paulette on scheduling the actual removal crew and handling the phone calls to the nephew in Tulsa, who as far as I know never asked a single question about why the timeline had slipped by almost 3 weeks from the original estimate. Cody told me, a few months later, once enough time had passed that he could talk about it without his voice changing, that he still sometimes woke up certain he'd heard my voice calling him from another room, even in his own apartment, miles from that basement, and that it had taken a long while for that particular kind of dread to fade all the way. He transferred into an office role with Crossroads not long after that, handling scheduling and client communication rather than field work, and he's good at it, better suited to it in some ways than he ever was to standing in strangers' empty houses. We still talk plenty. We just don't talk much about that January anymore. Not directly, though it comes up sideways sometimes, in the careful way he asks about any new file that involves an elderly owner who died alone. The actual trash-out crew. A different outfit entirely, subcontracted by Crossroads since our own team didn't handle full cleanouts. Went through the house about 3 weeks after our night in the flood, once the county roads had dried out enough for their truck to make the trip without trouble. I wasn't there for it, by my own choice, but the crew lead called Paulette afterward with a couple of questions that eventually got relayed to me. Mostly procedural things about how to log an item that didn't match anything on our original inventory sheet. He said they'd found, in a hall closet we'd photographed twice as holding nothing but winter coats and a broken umbrella, a man's dress shirt, pressed and folded, tags still on it from a department store that had closed its doors sometime in the 1990s, sized for a man built like the photograph of Harold Wardlow standing in front of that tractor. Nobody on that crew had any way of knowing what that shirt meant, and I didn't explain it to them beyond confirming it should be logged as an unlisted item and donated along with the rest. But I understood exactly what I was hearing. Whatever process had been reorganizing that house toward a version of itself from 11 days before Edith's stroke hadn't stopped the moment I cracked that kitchen window. It had simply, as far as I can tell, finished what it needed to finish and gone quiet. The way a fever breaks rather than the way a switch gets thrown. The crew lead mentioned one other thing to Paulette that she passed along to me almost as an afterthought, because she didn't think it was significant, and I understood immediately that it was. 2 of the 4 men on that crew had refused to go back inside after the first day, not over anything specific they could point to, just a feeling one of them described to Paulette as being watched by somebody who wasn't upset with him, exactly, just waiting on him to hurry up and finish so the house could finally be still. The crew lead, a practical man by every account, had chalked it up to a long day and an old unsettling building, the kind of unease plenty of people feel in any house where somebody died recently, and he finished the job himself with the 2 remaining men over an extra half day rather than force the issue. I think about those 2 men sometimes, workers who never read my incident report, who never heard about a lamp with no meter or a suitcase packed for a trip that never happened, arriving independently at the same conclusion Cody and I had reached the hard way. That the house wanted something finished and wasn't inclined to let anybody leave in a hurry until it was. A deputy named Roy Marsh took an official statement from both of us about 10 days after the incident, mostly because the trash-out crew, once they finally went through the house, reported the basement door latch broken clean off its frame, which is the kind of physical damage that has to get documented for the bank's insurance file regardless of how it happened. Marsh was polite, thorough, and about as skeptical as you'd expect a county deputy to be about a story involving a disconnected phone line and a voice in a flooded basement. He sat across a folding table from me in the sheriff's office annex, notepad open, and asked most of his questions twice, in slightly different phrasing, the way I understand they're trained to do when they're checking whether a story holds together on a second pass. At one point he asked me directly whether I'd been drinking that night, not in an accusatory way, just methodically ruling out the explanation before he could move past it, and I told him no, and I think my flat, unoffended answer to that question did more to convince him I was telling the truth as I understood it than anything else I said in that room. He didn't call either of us liars. He wrote it up, as far as I understand it, as a probable combination of storm-related electrical fault, an old and poorly maintained phone line crossing signal from somewhere else on a shared party line remnant, which does still happen in parts of that county on legacy infrastructure, and 2 exhausted men letting a stressful night amplify normal sounds into something more frightening than they actually were. Before I left his office that day, he told me, almost as an aside while he was walking me out, that he'd grown up 2 towns over from Cutter's Fork and had heard people talk about that stretch of dry hollow road his whole life, in the kind of vague, half-joking way small towns talk about a place without ever quite saying what they mean. He didn't offer anything more specific than that, and I didn't ask him to. I didn't argue with his report. There wasn't much point. I gave him the honest account and let him file it however his own understanding of the world required him to file it. What Marsh's report couldn't account for, and what I made sure was documented anyway even though I knew it wouldn't change his conclusion, was the utility co-op's second inspection, which I requested formally about 2 weeks later, specifically asking them to re-verify the meter status and check the panel itself for any possibility of a fault current I hadn't found on my own. The technician who came out, a different one than had originally pulled the meter, confirmed everything I already knew. No meter on the pole, no connection at the panel. He checked the wiring itself for stray voltage, induced current, anything that might explain a lamp glowing with no service, and found nothing. He told me, off the record, in the kind of tone a working man uses when he's telling you something he doesn't expect you to repeat to his supervisor, that in 15 years with the co-op he'd seen exactly one other property do something like what I was describing, an old house 2 counties over that had eventually been condemned rather than resold, and that he generally found it was better for everybody's peace of mind not to go looking too hard for the explanation once you'd confirmed there wasn't a wiring problem putting anybody at risk. The phone company's answer was similarly unsatisfying in the way that true answers to strange questions usually are. The legacy account attached to that line had in fact been closed administratively months before Edith's death even occurred. Part of a batch disconnection the carrier had processed years earlier when they retired an old exchange switch that served that stretch of county road. According to their own records, that line hadn't been capable of carrying a call, incoming or outgoing, in over 6 years. I have that letter. I've kept it in the same folder as my incident report ever since, because it's the single piece of paper that comes closest to proving something I otherwise have no way to prove, which is that whatever came through that receiver the night of the flood wasn't riding on any wire the phone company still owned or maintained. There were 2 other properties on that stretch of dry hollow road with files that touched on things I never got the full picture of. Older cases from before my time with Crossroads, one involving a hunting cabin the bank eventually just wrote off entirely rather than continue paying a crew to secure, and another I've only ever heard about secondhand from a contractor who used to work our territory before he moved on. I can't tell that part of it properly here, because I genuinely don't have the full documentation the way I do for the Wardlow file, but the members on the channel who've asked me about it get the fuller account I've pieced together, such as it is, because I don't feel right putting half a story out into the world when the rest of it might matter to somebody trying to make sense of their own strange county road somewhere. The Wardlow house itself never went back on the market the way most of these properties do. The bank's asset management team, after reviewing the file, which by then included my incident report, the utility confirmation, the phone company letter, and Deputy Marsh's official statement regardless of his own skeptical conclusions, made the decision in March to have the structure demolished rather than listed for sale, citing what their internal memo described only as elevated carrying risk and diminished marketability given the property's documented history. I don't know exactly what language made it into whatever file got passed around inside that bank's offices, and I don't know how many of the people who approved that decision actually believed any of it or simply decided a demolished lot was easier to explain away than a house nobody wanted to buy once word started getting around Cutter's Fork about the strange things a couple of property preservation contractors had reported out there. Small towns talk. I imagine it didn't take long for some version of the story to make its way from Deputy Marsh's office to the diner on Main Street to eventually the loan officers handling that file from a branch 2 counties over. I asked Paulette to keep me off the demolition assignment, and she did, without asking why, which I appreciated more than I told her at the time. Another crew handled the final walkthrough before the demolition contractor came through in April, and I made a point of asking that crew's supervisor, a man I'd worked alongside a few times before, to let me know if anything unusual turned up. He told me, a couple weeks after the house came down, that everything about the demolition itself had gone completely without incident. The house came down the way any old farmhouse comes down, faster and more completely than you'd expect given how solid it had looked standing, reduced to a cleared dirt foundation and a debris pile hauled off over the course of 2 days. There was one thing though that he mentioned almost as an afterthought. The kind of detail a person passes along because it's odd, rather than because they think it means anything. The demolition crew had cleared that site twice, once during the initial teardown, and once during a final grading pass a few days later to level the lot before it got seeded over with grass per the county's requirement for cleared foreclosure lots. Both times, once at the end of the first day and again after the second pass, somebody on the crew found a small vinyl suitcase sitting in the exact center of the cleared foundation, closed, undamaged, sitting upright as though somebody had set it down deliberately, rather than had it end up there by accident in a pile of demolition debris. Both times the crew swore up and down they'd already loaded that same bag into the debris hauler themselves, along with everything else pulled from the house during the trash out weeks earlier. Both times they loaded it up again and hauled it off with the rest of the load. Nobody on that crew, as far as I know, ever went looking for where it actually ended up after the second haul, and I've never asked, because there are some questions I've decided I'd rather not have definitive answers to. There's one more thing I did that spring, and I'm including it because I think it's the truest measure of what the Wardlow place actually changed in me, more than the light on a timer or the rule about windows. About a month after the demolition, on a Saturday I'd been putting off for the better part of a year, I finally went out to my garage and opened those boxes from my mother's house. I hadn't been able to make myself do it before then, not because I didn't have the time, but because going through them meant deciding, item by item, what she'd have wanted kept and what she wouldn't miss. The exact kind of small, constant judgment call that had felt unbearable to make about a woman who was still alive but no longer able to tell me herself which of it mattered. I thought about the Wardlow house the whole time I was doing it. About a dining chair pulled an inch further out with every passing month. About slippers turned toward a door nobody walked through again. I understood, sitting on my garage floor with my mother's old recipe cards spread out around me, that the difference between that house and my own situation wasn't as large as I'd wanted it to be. Grief doesn't need a death to get started. It can begin the moment somebody stops being able to come home to the version of their life you're still keeping ready for them. And I'd been keeping those boxes sealed in my garage for exactly the same reason that house had kept a suitcase half packed by a door, because finishing the job meant admitting the version of things we'd been waiting to return to wasn't coming back. I called my sister that afternoon, for the first time in longer than either of us would admit, and we went through the rest of it together over the phone, deciding what to keep for our mother's room at the facility, what to give away, what to finally let go. It took most of the day. It felt, when it was done, like something in my own chest had loosened the same way that kitchen had loosened the night I cracked that window open. I still work property preservation for 3 counties, and I imagine I'll keep doing it until my knees finish the job my back started warning me about a few years back. I don't nail windows shut anymore, on any property, regardless of what the checklist says, and I've started leaving one small solar-powered light on a timer in the front window of any long vacant house I secure. Something battery run and simple, the kind of thing nobody would ever question on an insurance inspection, but that gives a house a little bit of light in the dark hours regardless of whatever's actually happened to its wiring. I don't know if it does anything. I don't know if the Wardlow place was unique in whatever it was, or whether every one of these houses is capable of the same thing under the right circumstances and simply never gets pushed far enough to show it. I'd rather not find out the hard way a second time. Arlen Voss still lives on that road, last I heard, and still mows a strip of grass along a fence line where a house used to stand, out of a habit that outlived the need for it the same way Edith's porch light had. I drove out that way once, about 8 months after the demolition, mostly to see the cleared lot for myself in daylight, in a season with nothing frightening about it, just grass coming up green over bare dirt the way it does. I didn't stop at Arlen's place. I don't know what I would have said to him if I had. I sat in my truck at the end of that gravel drive for a few minutes, looking at where the porch used to be, and then I drove back out across the low water crossing on Sight's Branch, running low and clear that day, without a trace of the current that had once nearly kept 2 men from getting out of a house that had spent months trying, in its own way, to keep somebody from ever having to leave it again. I think about that house more than I probably should, for a man who spends his working life walking away from other people's finished stories. I don't think Edith Wardlow was ever malicious, not for 1 minute of any of it, and I don't think what moved through those rooms understood itself as frightening, any more than a person calling out for help in the dark understands how that sounds to whoever's trying to sleep in the next room. I think it was just a woman who left one morning fully expecting to come home, the way any of us would, and a house that kept faith with that expectation longer than anybody thought a house was capable of. Right up until 2 strangers with a bank's paperwork and a checklist full of good intentions accidentally told it, one sealed window at a time, that she wasn't coming back. I don't know what that makes the thing we dealt with in that basement, whether it deserves a gentler word than haunting or a harsher one. I only know what it asked for in the end wasn't very much, and that giving it cost me almost nothing except a little paint and a broken rule, and that I think about that trade every single time I walk up to a new lockbox on a new porch and have to decide, all over again, how much of the last resident's life I'm willing to leave undisturbed. I used to think the strangest part of ranger work was the silence. Now I know the strangest part is when the silence talks back, and it uses your own voice to do it. My name is Callum Ashby. I've spent 9 years as a backcountry patrol ranger for the Sable Creek Ranger District, inside the Cascade foothills of Washington State. and for most of those 9 years my job was about as far from frightening as outdoor work gets. Trail maintenance, wildlife counts, the occasional lost hiker who wandered off a marked loop and needed walking back to their car. I want to be clear about that, because what happened to me in the fall of my 8th season did not happen because I was reckless, or new, or unfamiliar with the ground. It happened on a stretch of trail I could have walked blindfolded. That's part of what made it so hard to explain away. I'm telling this the way I'd tell it to another ranger, plainly, in order, because the order matters. If I skip ahead, it stops making sense. Sable Creek District covers about 90,000 acres of second-growth and old-growth forest, cut through by logging roads that predate the district itself, some of them still drivable, most of them slowly disappearing back into the brush. Cell service exists in patches, mostly near ridgelines, and disappears completely the moment you drop into any of the district's deeper drainages. For radio coverage, we rely on a network of repeater stations bolted to ridge towers, most of them solar-powered, all of them maintained on a rotating schedule that falls, more often than not, to whichever ranger happens to be free that week. In late September that year, it fell to me. I was working a 2-week solo patrol out of a backcountry cabin near Fenwick Ridge, checking trail conditions ahead of hunting season, with a 19-year-old seasonal named Dana Okafor scheduled to join me for the second week to help with a repeater inspection at Table Rock, an old fire lookout site the district had decommissioned decades earlier but still used to house a remote radio relay. District Ranger Walt Brenner briefed us both before we headed out, the same way he briefed every solo patrol. Check in twice daily, log your coordinates, and if the Table Rock relay dropped signal for more than 6 hours, hike up and reset it manually rather than waiting for a scheduled crew. Walt mentioned, almost in passing, that Table Rock's lookout cabin had been closed to the public since 1988, after a ranger named Grady Pemberton had gone missing from that exact post during a routine overnight shift and had never been found. I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange detail to include in an otherwise routine equipment briefing. I didn't think much more about it than that. I want to be honest that I almost forgot about it entirely within the first few days. Almost. The first few days of that patrol went the way they always did. I logged trail conditions, cleared 2 blowdowns off the main corridor with a handsaw, and checked in with dispatch each morning and evening on schedule. Nothing unusual in either direction. The weather was clear and cold, the kind of dry autumn that makes the forest smell like dust and fallen needles instead of rain. And the only sound most nights was wind moving through the upper canopy and, occasionally, an owl working the ridge above the cabin. The first strange detail arrived on the 4th night, and at the time it seemed almost too small to mention. I was doing my evening check-in with dispatch, standard procedure, reading off my coordinates and confirming no incidents to report. Partway through the call, my handheld picked up a brief overlap, a half-second of crosstalk where someone else's transmission bled into mine, cut off almost immediately. It happens sometimes on a shared frequency, especially near dusk when atmospheric conditions shift. I mentioned it to dispatch, who said they hadn't picked up anything unusual on their end, and I let it go. I told myself it was nothing. At the time, that explanation made sense. It happened again the following night, longer this time, maybe 2 full seconds of overlap before my own transmission came through clean. And this time I caught enough of it to notice something that bothered me more than the interference itself. The overlapping voice had used my own call sign. Dispatch confirmed no other ranger on the district was transmitting on our shared channel that evening. I asked if it was possible some hobbyist or hunter with an illegal scanner setup was somehow bleeding into district frequencies, and the dispatcher, a calm, practical woman named Renata Kwan who'd worked that desk for over a decade, said it was possible but unlikely, since our repeater network used encrypted channels specifically to prevent that kind of interference. I wanted to believe there was a normal reason for it. I didn't have one yet, so I wrote the time down in my patrol log, the way you note anything that doesn't match, and I kept working. Dana arrived on schedule 6 days later, hiking in from the trailhead with a pack full of replacement parts for the Table Rock relay, which dispatch had flagged as intermittently dropping signal over the previous week. She was sharp, funny in a dry way, the kind of seasonal who asked good questions and didn't need things explained twice. I liked working with her. I mention that because it matters to how the rest of this went. We planned to hike up to Table Rock the following morning, do the relay inspection, and be back at the cabin before dark. That was the plan. It did not survive contact with what we found up there. The trail to Table Rock climbed steadily for about 3 miles before opening onto a rocky overlook where the old lookout cabin still stands. Boarded up, its catwalk railing rusted through in places, the relay antenna mounted on a newer steel mast beside it. We reached it a little after 10 in the morning. Clear skies, good visibility in every direction. Nothing about the site itself that struck either of us as unusual on approach. The relay's status light was blinking amber instead of steady green, indicating a partial fault rather than a full outage, which matched what dispatch had reported. Dana climbed the short ladder to the equipment box while I did a visual check of the antenna mount, and that's when she called down that the unit's internal log showed something that didn't make sense. A transmission logged at 2:47 that morning, nearly 8 hours before we'd arrived, originating from this exact relay, on my call sign, lasting 11 seconds. I hadn't transmitted anything at 2:47 that morning. I'd been asleep in the cabin, 3 miles away, with my handheld powered down on the charger beside my cot, a habit I'd kept for years specifically to save battery overnight. Dana asked if it could have been some kind of automated system glitch, a stored transmission replaying itself, and I told her that was possible, and at the time that explanation made sense to both of us, because neither of us wanted the alternative explanation yet. We played the logged audio back on the relay's small speaker. It was my voice, unmistakably, reading off patrol coordinates in the exact flat cadence I use for routine check-ins. The coordinates it read, though, weren't anywhere on my patrol route that week. They placed a location deep in a drainage below Table Rock, an area the district's maps listed simply as closed terrain, unmapped since a rockslide had rendered the old access trail impassable sometime in the early 90s. That was the confirmation moment, the one where I stopped being able to explain any of it away. A malfunctioning system doesn't invent a location that doesn't appear on any current map. It doesn't use a voice that sounds correct down to the small hesitation I make before reading a 6-digit grid reference, a habit specific enough to me that Dana, who'd worked beside me for less than a week, still recognized it immediately. We hiked back down before dark, both quieter than we'd been on the way up. That night, back at the cabin, I pulled the district's old incident files on my laptop, cached locally since we had no signal out here, and read through the file on Grady Pemberton for the first time since Walt had mentioned it. It was thin, the way old case files often are. Pemberton had reported in for his evening check-in on schedule the night he disappeared, then failed to check in the following morning. Search teams found the lookout cabin locked from the inside, his gear still packed, no signs of struggle. The search grid expanded over the following weeks to cover the entire drainage below the lookout, the same drainage whose coordinates had just come out of a relay in my own voice. They never found him. One detail in the file caught my attention specifically, a note from the search commander at the time, included almost as an aside. 2 other rangers assisting the search reported hearing radio traffic that night using Pemberton's call sign, reading off locations inside the closed drainage, hours after he'd already been reported missing. The search commander's notes described it, dryly, as likely radio interference or a prank, and moved on without further comment. I didn't sleep much that night. Dana didn't either, from what she told me the next morning, and around 2 in the morning, she said she'd heard something outside the cabin that she initially assumed was wind moving branches against the roof, until she realized the sound had a rhythm to it. 3 light taps, a pause, 3 more, repeating at intervals too regular for wind. She hadn't opened the door. She'd sat with her back against it until it stopped, roughly 20 minutes later, and hadn't wanted to wake me over what she was afraid might just be nerves. I want to be honest that hearing her describe that made the fear feel real in a way the relay log alone hadn't managed. It's one thing to doubt your own judgment. It's another thing entirely when someone else, someone reasonable, describes the same shape of wrongness independently. We radioed dispatch the next morning and told Renata everything. The transmission, the coordinates, the tapping. She logged it formally, and Walt authorized us to end the patrol early, sending a second team to escort us out rather than have us hike the full distance alone. That decision likely mattered more than any of us realized at the time, because of what happened on our final full day at the cabin, while we waited for the escort team to reach us. Late that afternoon, my handheld crackled to life on its own. No button pressed, no static preceding it, just my own voice, calm and clear, reading off a check-in exactly the way I would have phrased it, reporting my location as the closed drainage below Table Rock. Dana was standing right beside me and heard every word. The transmission ended the same way all my check-ins end, with my call sign and the phrase "all clear," except I hadn't said any of it, and I was standing in the cabin doorway 3 miles from where the coordinates claimed I was. What unsettled me most wasn't the impossibility of it, it was the tone. It sounded relaxed. It sounded like a version of me that had already accepted being down there, in ground the district had marked unsafe and unmapped for over 30 years, a version of me speaking in the exact voice I use when everything is fine. Dana grabbed my arm before I'd fully registered that I'd taken a step toward the trailhead without deciding to. I don't know, even now, whether I would have kept walking if she hadn't stopped me. I've turned that moment over more times than I want to admit. We didn't go looking for whatever was generating that voice. We didn't try to answer it, and we didn't try to explain it to each other beyond agreeing, out loud, that we were staying inside the cabin until the escort team arrived, regardless of what we heard outside. The tapping came again that night, closer to the door than before, and once, briefly, a voice just outside that used Dana's name instead of mine, in a register close enough to mine that she said afterward it made her stomach drop before she'd even processed what was wrong with it. We didn't open the door. That was the whole of what we did right, and it turned out to be enough. The escort team reached us the following morning. 2 rangers and Walt himself, who'd driven out personally once Renata briefed him on the overnight radio traffic. He didn't ask many questions on the hike out. I got the sense watching him that this wasn't entirely new information to him, that some version of this story existed somewhere in the district's institutional memory even if it had never made it into an official incident report. Table Rock's relay was decommissioned permanently within the month, replaced by a repeater station on a different ridge with no direct line of sight into the closed drainage below the old lookout. The district quietly stopped scheduling solo overnight patrols anywhere within 2 miles of that site, a policy change that appeared in the operations manual without any explanation attached to it. The kind of rule that exists because someone remembers why, even when the reason never gets written down. I asked Walt, once, months later, whether the district had ever formally connected what happened to Dana and me with what happened to Grady Pemberton in 1988. He told me the file stayed open, technically, the way most missing person cases do when there's never a body, and that the department didn't like drawing conclusions it couldn't support with evidence. Then he said, quieter, that he'd been the one who wrote the policy change into the manual, and that he hadn't needed anyone's permission to do it. Donna finished out that season and didn't apply to come back the following year. I don't blame her. I still work for the district, still take backcountry patrols most seasons, though I've never taken another solo assignment near that ridge, and I doubt I ever will. I still carry a handheld radio on every shift, the same model, the same channel, and there are nights, on quiet patrols in unrelated parts of the forest, when I catch a half-second of crosstalk on an otherwise empty frequency and feel my whole body go still before I can stop it. Most of the time it's nothing. Static, distance, some ordinary explanation I don't need to chase down. But I've never once in the years since let my handheld sit powered down overnight again. And I've never once ignored the sound of my own voice on a channel I know I haven't touched. Because the version of me that spoke from that drainage sounded relaxed for a reason. It had already decided I belonged down there. It was simply waiting for me to agree. I still carry a paper map of Marrow Hollow in my truck, even though the district digitized every trail system 8 years ago. I don't use it for navigation. I use it to remember exactly where the cable line sits, because I am the only ranger left on this district who has walked the ground on both sides of it. My name is Nate Carell. I've worked as a wildland ranger for the Talus Creek Ranger District, inside Corrigan National Forest, for 11 years, the last 6 of them as the senior field ranger responsible for training every new seasonal hire who comes through our office. Part of that training on day 1, before radio protocol, before the ATVs, before anything else, is a single rule that every ranger on this district learns before they learn each other's names. Nobody enters Marrow Hollow past the cable line. Not for a fire report, not for a lost hiker signal, not for anything you hear on the radio, no matter how it sounds. I want to explain how that rule works before I explain why it exists, because the order matters here. If you're the kind of person who likes settling in for something that gets under your skin slowly, Go ahead and like this video and subscribe now, because I don't think you'll want to stop partway through, and share it with somebody who thinks they'd have handled the hollow better than we did. Corrigan National Forest sits in mountainous country, the kind with narrow drainages that drop fast and hold fog well into the afternoon, old logging spurs that dead-end into brush, and a scattering of abandoned mining claims from the early 20th century that nobody bothered to properly seal. Marrow Hollow is one particular drainage on the district's eastern boundary, maybe 4 miles long, walled in on both sides by steep talus slopes that make radio reception unreliable even in good weather. The district's official explanation, the one printed in our public trail closure notices, cites unstable ground from historic mine subsidence and elevated heavy metal contamination in the soil and groundwater. Both of those things happen to be true. Neither of them is the reason rangers are told never to go in. The cable line marks the boundary. It's an old 3-strand steel cable, waist height, strung between iron posts sunk into the ground sometime before any of the district's current staff were born, running the entire western edge of the hollow where the access trail comes closest. There's a sign every 100 yards. Somebody replaces them when they weather out, has been doing that for decades, and the replacements always use the same language. Area closed. Do not cross. No explanation beyond that. Our district ranger, Vivian Holt, has run this office for 19 years, and she is not a superstitious woman. Vivian is the kind of supervisor who corrects your paperwork in red pen and expects you to know your own coordinates within 50 meters without checking a device. When she trains new hires on the hollow rule, she doesn't tell ghost stories. She gives them a very specific protocol, the same one she gave me my first week on the job, and she gives it in the same flat procedural voice she uses for wildfire evacuation routes. If you're ever near the cable line and you hear radio traffic on our channel that doesn't match a call sign you recognize, you don't respond. If you hear 3 short clicks followed by a voice, you don't respond, and you note the time. If anyone calls your name from inside the hollow, whether or not it sounds like someone you know, you retreat to the truck before you do anything else, including checking on them. I am mentioning that last part specifically because it became important later, and I want to be precise about what happened next. For most of my career that rule was easy to follow, because I never had a reason to test it. I'm telling you this story because of what happened in October 3 years ago, during my second season training a 19-year-old seasonal hire named Casey Dunmore, and because of what it cost us both to get out of that drainage with our names still meaning the same thing they meant when we walked in. Casey had grown up 2 counties over, the kind of kid who'd been camping since before he could read a topo map properly, eager in a way that made him easy to like and occasionally hard to manage. He'd memorized the district's trail system faster than any seasonal I'd trained before him, which made the hollow rule frustrate him more than it frustrated most people. He asked me about it constantly during our first few weeks together, half joking, half genuinely curious, the way smart 20-year-olds get when they're told not to ask questions about something. I gave him the same answer Vivian gave me. Contaminated ground, unstable slope, nothing worth the paperwork if someone got hurt. He accepted it, mostly, though I remember him saying once, while we were checking trail cameras near the district's eastern boundary, that it seemed like an awful lot of signage for a soil contamination issue. I told him plenty of federal land got oversigned for liability reasons. That was true, as far as it went. The first anomaly showed up on one of those trail cameras in early October, on a memory card I pulled during a routine equipment check. A task I'd done probably 200 times without incident. The camera sat about 60 yards outside the cable line, angled down a game trail we monitored for elk movement, nowhere near the hollow itself. Standard placement. I sat in the truck scrolling through 3 weeks of time-stamped images, mostly deer, one black bear at 2 a.m. on the 9th, the usual. Then, at 11:47 p.m. on the 14th, the camera had captured a human figure standing directly in frame, facing the lens. It was me. Same jacket, same ball cap, same posture I use when I'm checking equipment in the dark, one hand braced against my knee. The timestamp was accurate. The camera's internal clock synced automatically and had never malfunctioned before or since. On the night of the 14th I had been 40 minutes away at home, and my wife could confirm it because we'd watched a movie together and gone to bed before 10. I didn't tell Casey about the image right away. I told myself it was a resolution artifact, a trick of the infrared flash on a similarly built hiker, though I never found another photo of that supposed hiker anywhere else on the district's camera network, and nobody had logged a permit for that section that week. I flagged the card, noted the date in my personal log, the way I note anything that doesn't match the maintenance report, and moved on with the rest of my shift. That was the first time I lied to myself about what I was looking at. It would not be the last. The second anomaly came 9 days later, over the radio, while Casey and I were doing a routine burn pile check about a mile south of the hollow's access point. Our channel picked up 3 short clicks, evenly spaced, followed by a voice reading out grid coordinates in a format the district hadn't used since before digital mapping, a 6-figure grid reference system retired at least 15 years earlier, back when the Forest Service still used paper quads for dispatch. Casey reached for the mic out of pure habit. I put my hand over his before he could key it. "That's not one of our markers," I said, which wasn't quite the warning I meant to give him, but it was the true thing that came out first. He looked at me like I'd overreacted to nothing. To him it was probably a scanner picking up some old frequency bleeding through from a hobbyist or a neighboring district running legacy equipment. That explanation would have satisfied me too, 6 months earlier. But I'd worked this radio system for 11 years, and I knew our channel didn't cross with anything using 6-figure grids anymore. Not legitimately, not by accident. I noted the time, 2:14 p.m. I didn't mention the trail camera image, not yet, because admitting the two things might be connected meant admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern mirrored itself in ways that were harder to explain away individually, but easier to see as a pattern once you had enough of them lined up. A second trail camera, this one nearly a half-mile from the first, caught the same figure in the same jacket, time-stamped during a shift when I was confirmed present at a training session in the district office, 40 new hire employees as witnesses. A hunting party legally using a permit zone adjacent to the hollow reported to Vivian that they'd heard someone calling out coordinates over a handheld radio, using what one of them, a retired lineman familiar with old utility codes, described as outdated terminology, like something out of the 70s. And on the 29th, while doing an equipment sweep alone, I heard, faintly over the truck's radio, 3 clicks, followed by a voice that used my own call sign correctly, in my own cadence, asking dispatch to confirm a location inside the hollow that I had never in 11 years transmitted from. That was when I stopped thinking the radio was malfunctioning. A malfunction does not know your call sign. A malfunction does not wait for a plausible moment to use it. I went to Vivian that evening, laid out everything I'd collected, the 2 camera images, the coordinate transmissions, the times, the pattern. I expected her to tell me I was overtired, or point me towards some rational district history I hadn't been briefed on. Instead, she sat with it for a long moment, then pulled a locked drawer key from her desk and opened a filing cabinet I'd never seen her use. Inside were incident logs going back to the 1970s, each one describing some version of the same thing. A ranger's own voice, or a close approximation of it, heard transmitting from inside the hollow. A camera image of someone who was demonstrably elsewhere. And 4 of the entries, spread across 5 decades, a ranger had gone in after the voice, believing a colleague was in trouble. 3 of those 4 rangers came back out, 1 did not. The official record says he was reassigned to a district in another state, Vivian told me. That's what's in the personnel file, it's not what happened. She didn't tell me what she believed was actually inside the hollow, and I've come to think that's because she genuinely didn't know, not with any certainty she'd stake her name on. What she knew, with total certainty, was the protocol that kept people alive. Don't respond, retreat to the truck, never go in after a voice, no matter whose it sounds like. She'd inherited that rule from the ranger who trained her, the same way I'd inherited it from her, a chain of caution stretching back to whatever happened in 1974, when the first entry in that drawer was logged. I told her I understood. I meant it too. Right up until the second week of November, when the thing in the hollow stopped imitating my voice and started imitating Casey's. We'd had a hard stretch of weather move through that week, an early cold front that dumped 6 inches of wet snow across the district and washed out a culvert on the access road half a mile below our equipment shed, cutting off vehicle access to that whole section until a grader could clear it, which wasn't scheduled until the following Monday. Casey and I had hiked in on foot that Thursday to check on a downed power line reported near the eastern boundary, well clear of the hollow, both of us carrying handheld radios instead of relying on the truck unit. The line turned out to be a false report, a tangle of old fencing wire mistaken for a power cable by a hiker unfamiliar with the terrain. We were most of the way back to the washed-out culvert, losing daylight fast, when my handheld picked up 3 clicks, and then Casey's voice, clear as if he were standing next to me, calling my name from somewhere down toward the hollow. The problem was that Casey was standing next to me. He heard it too. I watched his face change in real time, watched him realize, the same way I had 3 weeks earlier, that something using his exact voice, his exact inflection, was calling out from a direction he had never walked toward. "That's not me," he said, quiet, like he needed to hear himself confirm it. "I know," I said. "We're not answering it, and we're not going toward it." We kept walking. The voice called again, closer this time than it should have been able to get if it were tracking our actual movement, closer than the terrain should have allowed anything to travel that fast through wet snow on a steep drainage slope. It used a detail neither of us had said aloud that day, mentioning the downed fence line by name, information it shouldn't have had unless it had been listening to us the entire hike, patient, waiting for something worth repeating back. That's the part that still bothers me more than the impossible voice itself. It wasn't just mimicking sound, it was rehearsing us, learning which details would make the imitation convincing enough to work. We made it back to the culvert crossing, and this is where the storm did what the storm does on this district. It turned a minor inconvenience into a real problem. The water had risen since morning, fast enough that the crossing we'd used going out was no longer safe on foot. Current pulling debris through a gap that had been a trickle 6 hours earlier. Casey, exhausted and rattled and moving faster than he should have on wet rock, misjudged his footing at the edge and went down hard, his ankle catching between 2 stones in a way that put him on the ground and kept him there. I got him upright enough to test weight and confirmed what I already suspected from the way he was breathing through it. A bad sprain. Maybe worse. Nothing broken outright, but nothing he could walk out on either, not through a 1.5 miles of washed-out terrain in the dark. Our handhelds had maybe 20% battery left between the 2 of them, and the district's main tower, the one that carried a reliable signal out of this drainage, sat on the far side of a ridge that blocked line of sight from where we were. That left us with one workable option, the kind of decision that only makes sense when you've spent 11 years learning a piece of ground well enough to trust it in the dark. A narrow game trail I knew climbed above the floodline and rejoined the main access road nearly a 1/4 mile past the washout, avoiding the crossing altogether. It ran close to the cable line for about 200 yards. Closer than either of us wanted, but not across it. I got Casey's arm over my shoulder and we started moving, slow, his weight dragging on my offside every few steps. The voice found us again almost immediately, and this time it wasn't calling my name or his. It was reading back, in Casey's exact voice, the plan I had just said out loud to him 30 seconds earlier. The game trail, the ridge, the distance to the road, word for word, from a direction that put it somewhere ahead of us on the very path I'd chosen. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it's the part that mattered most. I stopped walking. I told Casey quietly that whatever was ahead of us on that trail was not going to have accurate footing information, because it had never walked that ground the way I had, only listened to me describe it. I told him we were going to move off the marked trail entirely, cutting through unmapped brush along a route only I knew, one I'd scouted years earlier while tracking elk sign and never logged anywhere official, precisely because it wasn't a sanctioned trail. If the thing ahead of us was working from what it overheard, it couldn't follow a path it had never heard named. We left the trail. It was slower, brutal on Casey's ankle, branches tearing at both of us in the dark, but the voice fell behind within a few hundred yards and didn't call out again after that, not that night. We came out onto the access road nearly 40 minutes later, well past the washout, and Vivian met us there with a spare truck and a first aid kit, because I'd managed one short transmission on a stretch of ridge with enough line of sight to reach the tower before the batteries died completely. Casey's ankle turned out to be a severe sprain with a hairline fracture, 6 weeks in a boot, nothing that didn't heal. What didn't heal quite as cleanly was the way he talked about the district afterward. He finished out that season, mostly out of stubbornness, but he didn't come back the following spring, And the one time I asked him why, he said he didn't like knowing that something out there could learn him that fast, could take 40 minutes of overheard conversation and turn it into a voice good enough to nearly walk him off a ridge in the dark. There were 2 more incidents connected to the holo logged in Vivian's drawer after that season. Details I'm not able to lay out fully here, but the fuller case file, along with the original 1974 report that started that drawer in the first place, is something I've put together for people who join the channel. If you want to go further into it than I can cover in one video. The district quietly regraded and rerouted that game trail 2 summers ago, folding it into the official map under a different designation, though the cable line and its signs remain exactly where they've always been. Vivian updated our radio protocol formally that winter, adding a written line to the training manual that hadn't existed before. If a transmission uses information only the listener could have said aloud, treat it as hostile intelligence, not coincidence, and never route your escape through ground you've described out loud within the last hour. I still train every new seasonal hire on the holo rule during their first week, the same way it was given to me. I still carry the paper map folded to show the cable line in my truck door. And when I walk equipment checks anywhere near that eastern boundary now, I've made a habit Vivian never had to teach me. I don't say my plans out loud until I'm already moving, because the one thing I know for certain about whatever is inside Marrow Hollow is that it was never trying to catch me by being faster. It was trying to catch me by listening.